Imagine walking through a bustling metropolis 4,000 years ago, where every home had a private well and a sophisticated drainage system way before the Romans or Greeks. Now, fast forward to today, and we're still digging up clues about who these people were and why they vanished without a trace. In this video, we'll uncover the secrets of Asia's lost empire and what its collapse means for our own future. But before we get started, if you're new here, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps more people discover the channel. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. We're building something global here. So let's begin. The Indus Valley predates the earliest known Indian cultures by centuries. It pushes the timeline of the subcontinent's history back dramatically. It means that India had a great urban culture long before the so-called Vedic period. This changes everything historians thought they knew. The excavations begin in the early 1920s. Dairam Sani starts digging at Harappa in 1920 and 1921, uncovering bricks and artifacts that hint at something vast beneath the soil. Then, in 1922, Rakaldas Banerjee arrives at Mohenjo-Daro, a mound across the valley that holds even greater treasures. These two men work independently at different sites, their excavations separated by geography and timeline, yet soon realize they are excavating the same civilization. Sani's methodical work at Harappa and Banerjee's discoveries at Mohenjo-Daro reveal a unified culture stretching across the Indus Plain. The work continues through the 1920s and 1930s. Thousands of artifacts emerge from the earth: seals with intricate carvings, weights made of chert stone, beautifully crafted beads, copper tools, bronze weapons, terracotta figurines, children's toys. And the picture becomes clearer with each layer of soil removed. The cities themselves reveal their secrets. Mohenjo-Daro covers roughly 300 hectares. That is larger than the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia. Its streets run perfectly straight, intersecting at right angles. The main avenues are over 30 feet wide. Side streets are narrower, but still generous. This is not organic growth. This is deliberate design. The drainage system astonishes everyone. Every house has a bathroom. Every bathroom connects to a covered drain. The drains run beneath the streets. They have inspection holes for cleaning. Rainwater is channeled through the same system. Modern cities in the 1920s often lacked such infrastructure. Yet these ancient people had it figured out thousands of years ago. The bricks tell their own story. They come in a standard ratio, 1:4. Length, width, height. The same ratio appears at every site. This means the people had a unified system of measurement. They had organized production, they had quality control, they had engineers who understood mathematics and planning. The artifacts paint a picture of daily life: spindle whorls for spinning thread, clay lamps for lighting, cooking pots in various sizes, storage jars big enough to hold a person, a bronze dancing girl figurine, a stone bust of a bearded man wearing a patterned robe. These objects connect the ancient people to us. They are not abstract names on a timeline. They are humans with skills and tastes and routines. The mystery of the script deepens as more seals surface. Over 4,000 of them have now been found. Each one bears a short inscription, usually 5 or 6 symbols, sometimes accompanied by an animal figure. The writing appears on seals, pottery, and small tablets, but no long texts have been found. No royal proclamations, no historical records, just these brief, tantalizing messages. Scholars try every approach to crack the code. They compare it to Mesopotamian cuneiform, to Egyptian hieroglyphs, to later Indian scripts. Nothing works. The language remains unknown. The symbols remain silent. The people remain nameless. The civilization gets a name, though: the Indus Valley Civilization, named for the river that runs through its heart. Some scholars prefer Harappan civilization after the first site discovered. Both names appear in textbooks and scholarly papers. But the river name sticks in the public imagination: the Indus Valley, a place of water and mystery. What the archaeologists do not find is almost as telling as what they do. No palaces, no grand temples, no massive statues of kings, no obvious tombs filled with treasure. Other ancient civilizations built monuments to their rulers and gods. The Indus people apparently did not, or at least not in ways that survived. This absence puzzles researchers. Where is the center of power? Who made the decisions? How did such a large civilization function without a visible ruling class? The answers remain elusive. The civilization remains stubbornly opaque. The excavations face challenges. The water table at Mohenjo-Daro is high. The Indus River has shifted course over the centuries. Floods threaten the site. Salt damages the bricks. The archaeologists race against time and nature. Each digging season brings new discoveries and new dangers. The story of discovery itself begins earlier, though. In the 19th century, railway workers laying ballast for the expanding British rail network in India encounter ancient bricks. They are building a line through the region, and the local mounds offer convenient material. The workers gather bricks, load them onto carts, and use them to stabilize the tracks. No one recognizes the significance. To them, it is simply rubble to be recycled. Centuries-old bricks ground beneath locomotive wheels, their inscriptions facing downward into gravel beds. It takes time, decades in fact, before archaeologists begin to wonder where these bricks came from and why they bore such unusual markings. World events interrupt the formal excavations that begin in the 1920s. The Great Depression slows funding. World War II halts work entirely. The partition of India in 1947 creates new borders. Mohenjo-Daro ends up in Pakistan, Harappa too. The sites become national treasures of a new nation. Indian archaeologists continue their own searches. They find more sites, dozens of them, then hundreds. The civilization's reach extends far beyond what anyone imagined. Yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Why did these remarkable people build such advanced cities? How did they maintain such consistency across such a vast area? What happened to them? The silence of 4,000 years is hard to break. The discovery reshapes our understanding of human history. It proves that civilization did not develop in a single place and spread outward. It developed independently in multiple locations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, and now the Indus Valley. Three great river civilizations, three different paths to urban life. Three distinct solutions to the challenges of living together in large numbers. The railway still runs through Harappa. The trains still rumble past the ancient mounds. But now, people look at those mounds with different eyes. They see not just earth and ruins, but a civilization that once stood among the greatest in the world. The bricks that were once thought worthless ballast have become priceless witnesses to history. The story is far from complete. Excavations continue today. New technologies reveal new details. Ground-penetrating radar maps what lies beneath the surface. DNA analysis traces the movements of ancient populations. Satellite imagery identifies potential sites from space. Each advance in technology offers hope for new understanding, but the core mystery endures. We can admire the engineering. We can appreciate the craftsmanship. We can wonder at the organization required to build such cities. Yet we cannot hear their voices. We cannot read their thoughts. We cannot know their names. They remain the great unknown civilization, a people who built remarkable cities and then faded into silence. The discovery in the 1920s opened a door to a lost world. That door remains open, but the world beyond it is still full of shadows. The conversation with the past continues. The Indus Valley Civilization has much to say, but it speaks in a language we are still learning to understand. The mystery endures, and with it, the promise of understanding yet to come. The land and its people. The discovery of those buried cities sent ripples through the world of archaeology. But to truly understand what those bricks and beads meant, we must step back. We must look at the land itself. Because the Indus people did not choose this place by accident. The land shaped them. It fed them. And in the end, it would test them in ways they could never have imagined. Picture the map of South Asia. The massive triangular bulk of the Indian subcontinent pushing down into the ocean. At its northern edge, the Great Wall of the Himalayas, the highest mountains on Earth. And flowing down from those snowy peaks, a network of rivers that would become the foundation of an entire civilization. The most important of these was the Indus River itself. It begins high in Tibet, flows through Ladakh, then bends around the western Himalayas near Nanga Parbat before turning south through what is now Pakistan. Along its banks, the land opens into a vast floodplain, flat, fertile, and endlessly promising. But the Indus was not alone. To the east ran its great tributaries, the Ravi, the Sutlej, the Beas, and the Chenab. Together, they formed a system known as the Punjab. The name means 5 waters, and in ancient times, Those waters were everything. They brought silt, rich and dark, perfect for growing crops. They brought fish and waterfowl. They brought the possibility of life in a landscape that could otherwise be harsh and unforgiving. To the west, another river, the now dry Gagarhakra, traced a seasonal path. Many scholars believe this was the fabled Saraswati, a river of myth and memory. In its heyday, it may have rivaled the Indus itself, supporting dozens of settlements along its banks. Today, it survives only in dried channels and ancient stories. But in the time of the Indus cities, it was alive. It was water. It was the source of prosperity. Now, consider the climate. This is not a temperate land. The Indian subcontinent lives and breathes by the monsoon. For months, the sun beats down, the earth bakes, and the rivers shrink. Then around June, the winds shift. Moist air rolls in from the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. The sky darkens, the rains come. These monsoon rains were the engine of the agricultural year. They filled the rivers, recharged the groundwater, and made the desert bloom. The Indus people learned to read these patterns. They built their cities in the floodplains, where the annual rise and fall of the rivers brought fresh soil and water. They timed their planting to the rhythm of the seasons. Wheat and barley went into the ground in the cooler months after the floods had receded. They harvested in spring before the next summer's heat. But the monsoon was also a source of danger. Some years, the rains came late or not at all. Drought could wither the harvest and empty the granaries. Other years, the floods were too great, washing away fields and homes. The Indus people lived in a delicate balance with their environment. They could not control the sky. They could only adapt, prepare, and hope. The geography offered more than just water. To the east and south lay the great forests, home to the animals that would appear on their seals: the elephant, the tiger, the rhinoceros. To the north, the mountain passes led to Central Asia, bringing lapis lazuli and tin. To the west, the arid plateaus of Balochistan held copper and carnelian, and along the coast, the Arabian Sea opened a doorway to distant lands. The Indus people were not isolated. They were at the heart of a vast network. The rivers were their highways, boats carried goods upstream and down, carts with solid wooden wheels creaked along packed earth roads. Trade goods moved from village to city, from city to sea, and with them moved ideas and techniques. Now, think about the resources that sustained daily life. Wood came from the forests of the foothills. Stone, like the fine-grained steatite used for seals, was quarried from the mountains. Clay was everywhere, dug from the riverbanks and shaped into bricks, pots, and figurines. The Indus people fired their bricks in kilns, producing a hard, uniform building material that would outlast their cities by thousands of years. Then there were the plants and animals that shared their world: wheat, barley, peas, sesame, and dates. Cotton, too. The Indus people were among the first in the world to cultivate cotton, spinning it into cloth for their clothes. Cattle, water buffalo, goats, and sheep provided milk, meat, wool, and leather. The humped zebu bull became a symbol of strength and abundance, carved onto seals and molded into terracotta figurines. Life in the Indus Valley was not easy. It demanded hard work and careful planning, but it also offered a remarkable stability. The land was generous, the rivers were predictable, at least most of the time, and the people who lived there learned to make the most of what they had. Consider the view from above if you could float over the valley in those ancient days. You would see a patchwork of green fields, dark soil, and winding waterways. Small villages of mud brick houses dotted the countryside. And rising above them, larger settlements, the towns and cities, their walls and platforms visible from a distance. The roads between them were busy. Farmers led oxen pulling plows. Merchants drove carts loaded with grain and pottery. Fishermen cast their nets in the shallows. Shepherds moved their flocks to seasonal pastures. The land was not just a resource, it was a living presence. The rivers were sacred, their waters used for cleansing and ritual. The mountains were the homes of gods and spirits, their peaks touching the sky. The animals were companions, providers, and symbols of the forces that governed life. The Indus people did not separate nature from culture. They were part of it, woven into the same fabric as the rivers and the rains. This connection shows in their cities. The bricks, the drainage systems, the placement of wells and baths, all reveal a deep understanding of water and its management. They knew how to store it, how to channel it, how to use it without wasting it. They were masters of their environment, not because they dominated it, but because they listened to it. But even masters cannot control everything. The rivers could change course, the monsoon could fail, the land itself could shift and tremble. The Indus region sits on a geologically active zone. Earthquakes are not unknown there, and over the centuries, the very landscape that gave birth to this civilization would begin to change. The waters would grow less reliable, the floodplains would shift. The cities that once stood at the crossroads of abundance would find themselves stranded. But that is a story for later. For now, we are in the Golden Age. The land is rich, the rivers are strong, the people are thriving. They have found a home in this valley, and they are building something that will endure. They do not know that their world will one day fade. They only know the rhythm of the seasons, the promise of the rains, and the steady flow of the great river that gives them life. The Indus Valley was not just a place on a map. It was a world of water and earth, of crops and animals, of trade and craft. It was a land that asked much of its people, but gave back even more. And in return, they shaped it, honored it, and built upon it a civilization that still speaks to us across the ages, in bricks and seals and the silent testimony of the soil itself. Cities of wonder, but what the people of the Indus built upon that land would outlast their own memory. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were not accidents. They were plans drawn before a single brick was laid. The first thing you notice, even today, is the order. Streets run straight, crossing at right angles, forming a grid that speaks of careful thought. Not the winding alleys of older cities, but a deliberate layout. The main avenues ran north to south, east to west, some 30 feet wide. The smaller lanes branched off like veins. But the real genius was underground. Every street had a drain. Covered drains, built with precision, bricks laid with care and sealed with gypsum mortar. Manholes allowed access for cleaning. The wastewater flowed from homes through chutes into the street drains and out of the city. In the 1920s, when archaeologists first uncovered these drains, they were stunned. Much of the world still did not have indoor plumbing. And here was a civilization from 2500 BCE with a sanitation system that would not be matched for thousands of years. The people of the Indus did not simply survive, they lived with comfort. Rising above the residential quarters was a mound, a raised platform of mud brick supporting the most important structures. Archaeologists call it the citadel, but we do not know what it was actually for. In other ancient civilizations, the raised part of the city held the palace, the temple, the seat of power. But in Mohenjo-Daro, the citadel held something different. No obvious palace, no grand temple. Instead, a collection of public buildings that still puzzle us today. The most famous of these is the Great Bath, a pool of water 39 feet long, 23 feet wide, 8 feet deep, built of brick, sealed with bitumen, surrounded by a veranda. Steps lead down into the water from both ends. Small chambers sit at the edges, perhaps for changing clothes. The Great Bath was not a swimming pool. Water held deep meaning for the people of the Indus. Their cities existed because of the rivers. Their fields flourished because of the monsoon. Water was life itself, so a great pool at the heart of the city must have held ritual importance. We can imagine ceremonies taking place there, purification rites, festivals tied to the seasons, but we do not know. The silence of the Indus script leaves us with questions. Near the Great Bath stood other structures, a large building with colonnaded halls, perhaps a gathering place, a massive granary built on a raised platform with thick foundation walls designed to bear enormous weight. The granary tells us something important. This was a society that planned for the future. They stored grain against bad harvests. They managed surplus. Another granary was found at Harappa near the river, with loading platforms still visible. Grain arrived by boat. It was weighed, recorded, and stored. The city ran on systems of measurement, systems of trade, systems of governance. But here's the mystery. We see the systems, we see the results. We do not see the people who ran them. No statues of kings, no grand tombs, no monuments to individual power. The cities of the Indus were built for the collective, not for the few. Even the houses tell this story. Homes of different sizes, yes, but no vast palaces towering over hovels. The gap between rich and poor appears narrower than in other ancient cities. Perhaps that is why the Indus cities lasted so long. Harappa was occupied for over 1,000 years. Mohenjo-Daro, too. Generation after generation rebuilt, repaired, and maintained. They did not build for the moment. They built for the centuries. The construction techniques were careful and consistent. Walls were thick, foundations were deep. The builders understood the land they worked with. They knew the river could flood, so they raised their platforms accordingly. They knew the bricks would last if fired properly, so they fired them properly. Even the houses were designed for the climate. Thick walls kept interiors cool. Small windows kept out the sun, courtyards allowed air to circulate. The cities were engineered for comfort, not just for show. Walk through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro in your mind. The lanes are straight and clean, the drains are covered, the houses rise on either side, solid and quiet. There is no chaos here, no haphazard growth. Every structure fits into a larger whole. That is the true wonder of these cities, not any single building, not even the Great Bath or the granaries. The wonder is the vision, a vision of a city as a single harmonious system, where every part serves the whole, where the individual is important but the community is paramount. The Indus people achieved what few civilizations have managed before or since. They built cities that worked, cities that lasted, cities that expressed a shared way of life. And then slowly the water began to change. But that is a story for later, because for thousands of years they were forgotten. The rivers changed course, the cities crumbled, the people moved on, and the world forgot that such places ever existed until the 1920s, when a railway line needed ballast and workers found bricks. Old bricks, uniform bricks, bricks that did not come from any known structure. The bricks led to the ruins. The ruins led to the cities. And the cities revealed a civilization that had been waiting silently for someone to remember. Today, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa still stand. The streets are still visible. The drains still run beneath the surface. The Great Bath still holds the shape of its waters. They are not just ruins. They are a message from a people who believed in order, in community, in the simple dignity of a well-built home. We have not yet fully understood that message. The script remains silent. The religion remains unclear. The governance remains debated. But the cities speak for themselves. They tell us that civilization is not about kings or conquests. It is about how we live together, how we build our streets, how we manage our water, how we treat our neighbors. The people of the Indus built a world that worked. And then they vanished, leaving only their bricks behind. But what bricks they were, laid with care, measured with precision, built to last. In the quiet lanes of Mohenjo-Daro, a stranger from another time can still feel the pulse of that ancient order, can still walk the grid, can still trace the paths of water, and can still wonder, who were these people? The answer is written in the walls, in the drains, in the careful alignment of every street. They were planners, they were builders. They were a people who believed that how we live matters, and in that belief, they created a wonder that still stands today. Masters of the craft. Step through the gates of Mohenjo-Daro, and the first thing you notice is order. Sometimes a peacock or a tree motif decorates the clay. These pots were not just containers, they were canvases, and they were everywhere. In homes, in graves, in workshops, each one a small piece of the culture made physical. Then there were the beads, and here the skill reaches another level. The Indus people made beads from many materials: carnelian, a red-orange stone; agate, lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone imported from far away; steatite, a soft stone that hardens when fired. But the carnelian beads are the marvel. Carnelian is hard, harder than steel in some ways. To shape it, the bead makers used heat. They baked the raw stone slowly, then cooled it slowly. This brought out the deep red color and made the stone easier to work. Then came the drilling. They used drills made of chert, tipped with a hard abrasive. The holes are straight and true, sometimes only a millimeter wide, running through the entire length of the bead. How did they do it without breaking the stone? That question still puzzles researchers. Modern experiments show the precision resembles what ultrasonic drilling could achieve today, but the ancients almost certainly used bow drills with abrasive powder. A thin rod spinning between the palms or driven by a string pulled back and forth. Hours of careful work for a single bead. The patience required is almost hard to imagine. The finished beads were shaped into tubes, barrels, and discs. They were polished to a high shine, and they were strung into necklaces, bracelets, and belts. Some were so fine they must have been worn by the wealthy. Others were buried with the dead. They were prized items, traded far beyond the Indus region. But the most famous craft of all is the seals. Small squares of steatite, usually about 2 to 3 centimeters across, each one carved with a design and a line of script. They are found in huge numbers. Over 3,500 have been recovered so far, and each one is a miniature masterpiece. The carvers worked with copper tools and abrasive powder. They carved the image in reverse, so when pressed into clay, it appears the right way. The most common motif is the unicorn, a single-horned animal standing before a mysterious object. Some say it is a feeding trough, others say a ritual stand. No one knows for sure. But the image repeats again and again in city after city. Then there is the humped bull, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the tiger, the water buffalo, each animal rendered with a few bold lines full of life. Some seals show composite creatures, a human head on a tiger body, a horned figure surrounded by animals. These may be glimpses of myths or deities we will never fully understand. The seals had practical uses too. They were pressed into wet clay tags used to mark goods in trade. A merchant would tie a bundle, press his seal into a lump of clay, and the seal became a signature. It said, "This is mine. This is genuine. This came from my workshop." In a world without paper or written contracts, the seal was the closest thing to a legal document. Some seals were made of faience, a glazed ceramic that shines like glass. Others were carved from shell or ivory, but the steatite ones are the most common and the most beautiful. The carvers knew their material. They knew how to polish it, they knew how to carve it, and they knew how to fire it. So the surface turns white and hard, like porcelain. It is a craft that took years to master. Now think about the copper and bronze workers. They melted metal in clay crucibles. They cast it into tools and weapons, axes, chisels, knives, fishhooks, spearheads. But they also made mirrors, polished discs of bronze that reflect light and image, and they made small figurines. The most famous is the dancing girl, a small bronze statue of a young woman, one hand on her hip, her head tilted back. She wears bangles on her arm, a necklace around her neck. She stands with confidence. She is about 10 centimeters tall, but she carries a presence that fills a room. When archaeologists found her in 1926, they were stunned. She looked so modern, so alive. The Indus metal workers also used the lost wax method. They made a wax model, covered it in clay, then heated it. The wax melted and drained away. Molten metal took its place. When the clay broke open, there was a perfect metal copy. This technique is still used today. But these artists were doing it 4,000 years ago. Stone carving was another skill. They made vessels from soft stone like alabaster and calcite. They made weights, and they made small figurines like the famous priest king, a bearded man wearing a robe with a trefoil pattern. His eyes are half closed as if in thought. He is carved from steatite, polished to a soft glow. He might be a ruler. He might be a priest. He might be a legend. His identity is unknown, but his dignity is clear. Shell workers made bangles, inlays, and decorative pieces. They cut the shell with copper saws and shaped it into thin rings. These bangles were worn by women and men alike. They were status symbols, signs of wealth and beauty. Some were plain, others were carved with intricate patterns. Then there was the pottery painting. Not all pots were plain. Some were covered with elaborate designs. The painters used a fine brush made of hair or plant fiber. They drew lines that curve and cross, creating rhythms of color on the clay. They used natural pigments, red ochre for red, black manganese for black, white for accents. The designs vary from site to site, but the style is unmistakably Indus. And now, the most remarkable thing about all this craft, the consistency. Across a region larger than modern Egypt, across a time span of nearly 700 years, the Indus people maintained the same standards, the same brick size, the same weight system, the same seal motifs. This was not a loose collection of villages. This was a civilization with shared values, shared techniques, and shared trade routes. They did not have a single ruler, as far as we know. They did not have one capital city, but they had a single way of doing things. And that unity is itself a form of mastery. So when you look at a small carnelian bead, remember the hours of work that went into it. When you hold a seal, imagine the artist who carved it sitting by the light of a small lamp, his tools spread around him. He was not famous. His name is lost. But his handiwork survived 4,000 years, and it still speaks to us. It tells us that the people of the Indus Valley were not just survivors. They were creators. They were makers of beautiful things. And their craft was a language of its own, written in stone, clay, and metal. A language we can still read, even without knowing their words. The written word. The written word. The craftsmen of the Indus left behind their beads, their pots, their perfect weights, writing, thousands of tiny objects covered in strange symbols, and yet no one can read them. The voices of an entire civilization locked behind a code we cannot crack. It is the great silence of the ancient world. The story begins in the 1920s. When John Marshall and his team first uncovered the ruins, they found small carved stones scattered among the debris. Steatite seals, they called them. Soft stone, carved with precision, then fired until hard. Each one bore a short line of symbols running along the top. Below that, a picture. At first, the excavators thought they were just decorations. But then they found the same symbols on other objects. The same shapes repeating across hundreds of miles. The same sequences over and over. And then the realization hit like a cold wave. No one could read it. The script itself is strange. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Sumerian cuneiform, it does not look like anything else. The symbols are brief. Most are made of straight lines and precise curves. There are roughly 400 distinct signs, though many are variations of a basic set of about 40 to 60 core symbols. The writing runs from right to left. We know this because the symbols are sometimes cramped on the left side of an object, as if the carver ran out of space. The script is also remarkably consistent. The same signs appear in the same order across different cities, different materials, different centuries. It was a standardized system used across an area larger than modern France. But here's the strange part. The longest one found so far contains just 17 symbols. There are no long texts, no royal proclamations, no epic poems carved into stone walls. It is as if a people wrote constantly, but only in small doses. This makes the task nearly impossible. Since the discovery, some of the greatest minds have tried. They have all taken their turn at the Indus script, and they have all walked away frustrated. Without a bilingual text, we cannot match the symbols to a known language. And without knowing the language, we cannot match the symbols to sounds. It is a loop with no entry point. Some scholars believe the script represents an early form of Dravidian, the language family that includes Tamil and Telugu. They point to similarities in word order and grammar. They suggest that certain symbols correspond to Dravidian words for fish, star, and mountain. They reconstruct phrases like gift for the temple or trade agreement between cities. They imagine the seals as records of merchants and rulers, names and titles pressed into clay for trade. In 2004, a team of researchers published a paper that shook the field. They had used computer analysis to study the patterns in the script. They found that the symbols behave like a true writing system, that the same symbol can represent different things depending on its context. A fish on its own might mean fish. A fish next to a certain sign might mean star. A fish in another position might be a name. The findings were fascinating and inconclusive. The algorithm found patterns, but it could not tell us what they meant. It was like hearing a melody without knowing the lyrics. The people themselves are silent. We do not know what they called their cities, their rivers, their gods, their children. We do not know if they wrote poetry or laws or love letters. We do not know if they had a word for forever or home or goodbye. But we know they wrote. We have thousands of their inscriptions. Seals with their symbols, pottery with their marks, copper tablets with their records. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to leave a trace, and they succeeded. We remember them. We just cannot hear them. The mystery is not just academic. It touches something deep in us, the need to connect, to understand, to hear the voices of those who came before. Every undeciphered script is a closed door. Every unknown language is a person we cannot meet. The scholars who work on this puzzle know the odds. They know that without a bilingual text, the code may never be broken. But they keep trying because sometimes a new inscription appears, a new seal, a new tablet, a new pattern, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will be the key. There is also hope in the wider world of ancient scripts. Linear B was deciphered in the 1950s after decades of failure. Egyptian hieroglyphs were cracked with the Rosetta Stone. Mayan writing was unlocked in the 1970s. Each one seemed impossible until it was not. The Indus script may be next, or it may remain forever silent. Either way, the search continues, the questions remain, and the mystery endures. There is something beautiful in this failure. A civilization so advanced that it built cities with running water, so skilled that its craftsmen produced objects of stunning beauty, so organized that it traded across the known world, and yet it left a script that refuses to yield. A final act of defiance from a people who disappeared 4,000 years ago. Perhaps they knew. Perhaps they understood that the writing would outlast them, that the symbols would survive the fall of their cities, the shifting of their rivers, the dust of their graves, that someone, someday, would hold a tiny stone seal and wonder. And wonder is its own kind of connection. The Indus script stands as a monument to what we do not know, a reminder that history is full of gaps, that the past is not a book waiting to be read, but a puzzle with missing pieces, and that some mysteries are worth keeping. For now, the writing remains, carved in stone, fired in clay, buried in the earth, waiting. The people who made it are gone, their language is gone, their stories are gone, but their symbols remain, silent, patient, eternal. And every time a new seal is unearthed, the hope returns, the hope that this one will be different, that this one will speak, that this one will break the silence. It has not happened yet, but the search continues. Because that is what we do. We are the species that digs up the past, that holds a tiny stone in our hands, that traces our fingers over lines we cannot read, that feels the weight of a mystery we cannot solve. And we keep trying. The written word is the most powerful thing we have ever created. It lets us speak across time, across distance, across death. The Indus people knew this. They wrote their words on tiny pieces of stone and they threw them into the river of time. The words are still there, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to understand. Maybe someday we will, but for now, the mystery remains. The silence holds. And the script, beautiful and unreadable, continues its long wait for a voice. Seals and symbols. The script on those tablets was a door, but the seals were the keys, small, square, carved from a soft stone called steatite. Most fit in the palm of your hand. Yet they carried the weight of an entire civilization. The elephant, heavy and wise, the tiger, all coiled muscle and hidden danger, the rhinoceros, armored and ancient. Each animal rendered with a few sure strokes, capturing the essence rather than the detail. Some seals show scenes, a man seated in a yoga pose surrounded by beasts. Scholars call him the Pashupati seal, though the name is a guess. Horns on his head, 3 faces, maybe 4. Animals gathered at his feet. Is this a god? A priest? A king? We cannot say. The image survives, but its meaning has dissolved into time. The carving is only half the work. The craftsman flips the seal over. On the back, a boss. A small raised knob, often pierced. A cord runs through it so the owner can wear it on a string. Around the neck, tied to a wrist, always within reach. Then the kiln again. This time the heat transforms the steatite. It hardens, turns to a glossy white. Some seals get a different treatment. A wash of alkali, a second firing, and the surface becomes a brilliant faience blue. Others are carved from dark stone, almost black. Some from terracotta, baked clay. Each one unique. Each one a signature. The purpose of these seals remains a matter of debate, but the evidence points in clear directions. Trade first. The seals were pressed into soft clay. Wet lumps of mud packed around the lids of jars, the knots of bundles, the fastenings of sacks. The seal came down like the image pressed in. When the clay dried, it hardened into a permanent lock. Anyone who broke it left a mark. Anyone who opened the jar left evidence. But the seal did more than lock, it identified. The merchant pressed his seal into the clay before sending goods on a long journey. At the other end, the receiver saw the image. He knew who had sent the shipment. He knew its quality, its origin, its trustworthiness. The seal was a brand, a guarantee, a promise made in stone. The Indus people traded far beyond their river valley. Their seals have been found in Mesopotamia, in the cities of Sumer and Akkad. There, in the mud of Ur and the ruins of Lagash, excavators have pulled out these small square stones, unmistakably from the Indus. And in reverse, Mesopotamian cylinder seals have appeared in Indus cities. 2 civilizations, thousands of kilometers apart, connected by a thin thread of trade and a shared language of stamped clay. The unicorn seal carried a specific meaning in this trade. Its presence on a bag of grain or a jar of oil told the receiver something. Perhaps it marked the goods of a particular merchant house. Perhaps it marked a specific quality grade. Perhaps it marked a family, a clan, a guild. The unicorn appears on so many seals that it may have represented something fundamental to their world. Yet what that something was remains beyond our reach. Perhaps it identified a trading house of great renown. Perhaps it spoke to beliefs now lost to silence. But the seals were not only for trade. Some show signs of administration. A seal found in Mohenjo-Daro, pressed into clay, still bears the faint impression of a rope. It had secured something. A document, perhaps. A record of a transaction. A receipt for goods received. The bureaucracy of the Indus cities ran on these small stones. The sheer number of seals found in certain buildings suggests record-keeping on a large scale. Storehouses would have needed seals to authorize the release of grain. Officials would have needed seals to validate their orders. The seals were the signature of the state, whatever form that state took. And then there is the religious dimension. The animals carved on the seals are not random. They appear again and again, always the same creatures, always in the same poses. This consistency suggests meaning. The unicorn, the bull, the elephant, the tiger, the rhinoceros, each one may have represented a deity, a clan totem, a cosmic force. The Pashupati seal, with its seated figure surrounded by beasts, hints at a belief system where humans and animals share a sacred bond. The swastika appear on some seals, a simple symbol, 4 arms bent at right angles. Today it carries a heavy burden of association, but in the Indus Valley it was a mark of good fortune, a sun symbol, a luck charm, a sign of well-being. It appears on seals, on pottery, on small tablets, always small, always carved with care. Some seals' shields show mythical creatures. A horned tiger, a 3-headed animal, a figure with the body of a human and the horns of a beast. These are not natural animals. They are inventions, combinations, hybrids that could only exist in the imagination. Their presence speaks to a rich mythological world, one that we can glimpse but never fully enter. The seals also served a more personal purpose. A seal was a personal object. It was worn on the body, carried through life, used to mark the owner's presence in the world. When a merchant sealed a transaction, he was not just using a tool. He was asserting his identity, his place in the social order, his claim to the goods being shipped. The craft of seal making was passed down through generations. A master carver would train an apprentice, showing him how to hold the copper tool, how to apply just the right pressure, how to see the animal hidden in the blank stone. The techniques were refined over centuries. The early seals are simple, almost crude. The later ones are masterpieces of miniature art. The decline of the seals mirrors the decline of the civilization. As the cities emptied, the workshops fell silent. The carvers moved on or died or simply stopped. The last seals are rougher, less careful. The skill was fading. The knowledge was being lost. But the seals themselves survived. Buried under centuries of earth, they waited. When the archaeologists came in the 1920s, they found thousands of these small stones, each one a message from a vanished world, each one a key to a door that still will not open. Today, the seals sit in museums, in Lahore, in Delhi, in London. Behind glass, carefully lit, they look small and fragile. But hold one in your hand and you feel its weight, its history, its mystery. The unicorn still stands, patient, eternal, before its unknown object. The bull still lowers its horned head. The elephant still lifts its trunk. They have outlived their makers by 4,000 years. They have outlived their purpose, their meaning, their world. And yet they speak, not in words, but in images. Not in script, but in symbol. They tell us that the people of the Indus Valley were not just farmers and merchants. They were artists. They were thinkers. They were a people who believed that a small stone carved with care could carry meaning across distance and time. The seals were the signature of a civilization, and that signature has never been forged. Everyday life. These houses had multiple rooms. A courtyard often sat in the center, open to the sky. This allowed light and air inside while keeping privacy. Stairs suggest upper floors or flat roofs for sleeping in hot months. Each house had a bathing area. The floor sloped to a drain. That drain connected to covered channels running under the streets. Clean water came from wells built within neighborhoods. Some houses had their own wells, others shared a public source. This attention to hygiene stands out. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about health. Cities packed with thousands of people breed disease. The Indus people fought that danger through design. They carried wastewater away. They provided fresh water close to homes. They kept streets clean. The result was a remarkably healthy urban population for its time. Work shaped daily rhythms. Most people worked with their hands. Potters spun clay into vessels. They used the wheel, turning out pots of remarkable consistency. Some pots were plain, others were painted with geometric patterns, trees, and animals. The potter fired his wares in kilns reaching high temperatures. The finished products filled kitchens and storerooms across the city. Weavers worked looms. They produced cloth for clothing, sacks, and trade goods. Bead makers ground stones into tiny cylinders and discs. They drilled holes with copper tools and abrasives. They polished each bead to a shine. Some beads were so small that dozens would fit on a fingertip. The patience required is staggering. Metal workers shaped copper and bronze. They made tools like axes, chisels, and knives. They made vessels and ornaments. They even cast figurines using the lost wax method. This involved making a wax model, covering it in clay, then heating it. The wax melted away, molten metal filled the gap. When cool, the clay broke away. What remained was a perfect metal copy. The famous dancing girl figurine came from this process. She stands with one hand on her hip, confident and poised. She is only 10 centimeters tall, but she radiates personality. Brickmaking was its own industry. Kilns fired thousands of bricks to standard sizes. Ratios of 1:2:4 held true across the entire civilization. This uniformity meant builders could plan structures without worry. Any brick would fit anywhere. It was an early form of standardization, one that made construction faster and more reliable. Farmers worked outside the city walls. They grew wheat and barley in the floodplains. The Indus River flooded each year, leaving fresh silt. This silt was incredibly fertile. Farmers sowed crops after the floods receded. They harvested in spring. They also grew peas, lentils, chickpeas, and mustard. Sesame provided oil. Dates grew along the river. Cotton was cultivated for fiber. The surplus from these farms fed the cities. Animals were partners in this work. Cattle pulled plows and carts. Water buffalo provided milk and muscle. Sheep and goats offered wool, meat, and hides. Donkeys carried loads. Camels may have been used for long-distance trade. Dogs guarded homes and flocks. The bond between humans and animals was close. It shows in the art. Animals appear on seals, figurines, and pottery. They were economic assets. They were also companions. Markets buzzed with activity. Merchants weighed goods using standardized stone weights. These weights followed a precise system. Small cubical weights of chert and jasper, larger weights of limestone and steatite. They doubled at each step from fractions of a gram to over 10 kilograms. This system allowed fair trade. It built trust, and trust was the foundation of commerce. Children learned by watching. Boys followed fathers into workshops. Girls helped mothers with cooking and weaving. Education was practical. It happened through doing. Toys have been found. Whistles shaped like birds, small carts with wheels, clay animals, dolls with articulated limbs. Children played games that look familiar. They raced toy carts, they made mud houses, they imitated the world around them. Family structure is harder to see. Houses varied in size. Some had just 2 rooms, others had a dozen. This suggests different family sizes and wealth levels, but the layout of most houses follows a similar pattern. A central courtyard, rooms around it. This design works well for extended families. Grandparents, parents, and children sharing one home. It was common in South Asia for thousands of years. It likely started here. Women's roles are equally complex. Some scholars once assumed women stayed home, but the evidence tells a different story. Figurines show women in elaborate poses. They wear jewelry and distinctive hairstyles. Women likely managed households. They oversaw food preparation, textile production, and childcare. They may have also worked in crafts. The making of cloth was often women's work. So were certain stages of bead production. The presence of female figurines in many homes suggests women held spiritual importance too. Their status may have been higher than earlier scholars believed. Men took on roles in farming, construction, and trade. They worked as builders, metal workers, and merchants. They traveled along trade routes. They brought back copper, tin, precious stones, and timber. They managed the flow of goods that kept cities supplied. Society was not flat. Differences in wealth existed. Some houses were larger, some graves contained more ornaments, but the gap between rich and poor seems smaller than in other ancient civilizations. There were no massive palaces, no towering statues of rulers, no obvious elite tombs filled with gold. Instead, the Indus people built public infrastructure: wells, drains, baths. Their priorities were collective, not individual. This doesn't mean they had no leaders. Someone organized the brick production, someone planned the street grids, someone managed the granaries. But these leaders did not flaunt their power. They built for the community. The city itself was the monument. The evening comes. Families gather, food is shared, stories are told, children fall asleep on woven mats. The city quiets. Only the occasional bark of a dog breaks the silence. Tomorrow will be another day of work, but tonight there is rest. The Indus people lived lives full of labor and small pleasures. They made beautiful things. They built clean cities. They raised families. They traded across vast distances. They left no grand tales of kings and conquests. Instead, they left streets and drains, toys and beads, ovens and wells. These ordinary traces tell an extraordinary story, a story of people who figured out how to live well together, people who valued cleanliness and order, people who created beauty in everyday objects. They did not need monuments to themselves. Their civilization was the monument, and in the quiet lanes of Mohenjo-Daro, in the warm kitchens, and the workshops filled with dust and noise, we find them. Not as distant figures in a textbook, but as people. People much like us, waking up, working, caring for their families, and building a world that would echo through time. Their tools were simple, their materials were humble, but their achievements were anything but small. They showed that a civilization does not need kings to thrive. It needs shared values. It needs cooperation. It needs people who care about the common good. The Indus people had all of this, and their daily lives prove it. The great bath morning light creeps over Mohenjo-Daro's baked brick walls. The city stirs, but at its heart there is stillness. A pool of water, 40 feet long, 8 feet deep, sealed so perfectly that not a drop seeps through after 4,000 years. This is the Great Bath, and it has no equal anywhere in the ancient world. Let's understand what the people of Mohenjo-Daro built here. They dug a massive pit into the ground, not in the outskirts, not hidden away, right in the center of the city's raised citadel. They lined it with layer upon layer of waterproof brick. Then came bitumen, a natural tar that seeps from the earth. Then more brick. The finished walls are so dense, so carefully fitted, that they hold water to this day. Think about that for a moment. The engineers of 2500 BCE solved a problem we still struggle with: how to keep a massive pool watertight. They did it with materials found in their own backyard, no imported miracles, just observation, patience, and skill. The bath sits in a courtyard. Around it, a corridor runs on all four sides. Small rooms flank the structure. Steps descend into the water from the north and south, their edges worn smooth by countless feet. A drain at one corner could release the entire contents when needed. Fresh water would come from a well nearby or from the great river itself. But the details matter even more, and here's where the Great Bath reveals something profound about its builders. The bricks are uniform, every single one. Same size, same shape, same firing process. This isn't chance, it's a promise, a standard that every craftsman in the city agreed to follow. When a society builds with such consistency, it speaks of shared values, of a culture that prized order and precision above individual flair. Now, the question that haunts archaeologists: what was this pool for? The obvious answer: bathing. But that seems too simple, too practical for such a monumental structure. A city with working drains and private bathing platforms didn't need a giant public pool for hygiene. The people of Mohenjo-Daro already knew how to stay clean at home. So we looked deeper. The bath sits on the highest ground in the city, the citadel. This was the sacred heart of Mohenjo-Daro, the place where important buildings gathered. To place a water pool there, in the center of ceremonial space, suggests meaning beyond the practical. Water, in this part of the world, has always carried spiritual weight. The monsoon brings life. Rivers nourish crops. To this day, rivers like the Ganges are considered holy. Perhaps the Great Bath may have held ritual importance, an early expression of this same reverence. A place where water became ceremony, where cleansing the body merged with cleansing the spirit. The steps leading into the pool could have been used for ceremonial descent. The surrounding gallery might have held onlookers, witnessing whatever ceremonies took place in the water. The small rooms could have served as changing areas or preparation spaces for priests and participants. We cannot know for certain. The Indus people left no written records we can read. No carvings explain the bath's purpose. No paintings show its use. We have only the structure itself and the patterns it reveals. But consider what its presence tells us. A society builds what it values. The Great Bath required enormous resources, thousands of work hours, careful planning, skilled labor. The people of Mohenjo-Daro chose to spend all of this on a pool of water, not on a palace for a ruler, not on a fortress for defense, not on a monument to a king's ego. A bath, central, elevated, perfectly constructed. This choice speaks volumes about Indus society. Look around the citadel and you'll notice what's missing. No grand temples dominate the skyline, no towering statues of emperors, no lavish tombs. The most impressive structure in all of Mohenjo-Daro is a public water facility. That's remarkable. In Egypt, the pharaohs built pyramids to themselves. In Mesopotamia, kings raised ziggurats to their gods. In the Indus Valley, the people built a bath. This suggests a society more egalitarian than its contemporaries, a culture where communal well-being mattered more than individual glory, where civic infrastructure was the highest achievement, where water, the source of life, received the greatest honor. The engineering alone demands respect. The builders understood drainage, waterproofing, and structural integrity in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Roman engineers would later construct similar baths, but they came 2,000 years later with different materials and centuries of accumulated knowledge. The Indus engineers figured it out on their own, with mud bricks and bitumen and careful observation of how water behaves. The courtyard surrounds the pool like a frame around a painting. The gallery walls once stood 2 stories high. Wooden columns supported a roof that sheltered the walkway from sun and rain. Bathers would descend the steps, the water cool against their skin, the sounds of the city muffled by thick walls. Nearby, a series of wells provided fresh water. A sophisticated drainage system carried waste away. The entire complex worked as one integrated machine, each part serving the whole. This integration mirrors the city itself. Mohenjo-Daro's streets follow a grid. Every house connects to covered drains. Every block has access to wells. The Great Bath is not an isolated marvel, but the culmination of a culture's relationship with water. For here's what the Indus people understood. Water is life. It cleanses, it refreshes, it sustains, and it deserves to be treated with care. This philosophy extends beyond the Great Bath. Private homes throughout the city had their own bathing areas, often with sophisticated drainage. The Indus people were among the first to develop urban sanitation on such a scale. They knew that cleanliness and health walked hand in hand. The Great Bath stands empty now. The water that once filled it evaporated long ago. The wooden roof collapsed. The walls, though, remain strong, silent, waiting. And in that silence, the structure speaks. It speaks of a people who valued community over hierarchy, who invested in shared spaces rather than private monuments, who saw water as something worthy of reverence. It speaks of engineers who solved problems with elegance and precision, of craftsmen who worked to exacting standards, of a society where many hands came together to build something that would outlast them all. We will never know the rituals that may have taken place here. We will never hear the prayers that echoed off these walls. We will never see the faces of the people who descended those worn steps. But we know this much. They built something beautiful, something functional, something that still moves us 4,500 years later. The Great Bath is more than an ancient swimming pool. It is a window into the values of a civilization that invested its greatest resources in something shared, a civilization that understood water not as a utility alone, but as something deserving of care and consideration, a place to wash, a place to gather, a place to be clean in body and in spirit. The sun climbs higher over Mohenjo-Daro. Dust settles on the ancient brick. Visitors walk the corridors, and their footsteps echoing where others once walked. They peer into the empty pool and imagine it filled, gleaming, alive. Somewhere in that imagination, the Indus people live again. They descend the steps, the water ripples, and for a brief moment the great bath fulfills its purpose once more, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a gift to be received. A gift from a civilization that knew exactly what mattered and built accordingly. Trade networks. The Mesopotamians clearly recognized their value. In fact, they respected the Indus traders so much that they created a special word for them, Meluha. The land of Meluha appears in Akkadian texts, described as a far-off place of black stone, carnelian, and exotic woods. Modern scholars are confident Meluha means the Indus Valley. The name appears in records of trade expeditions, tax collections, and diplomatic gifts. Now, one text from the reign of Sargon of Akkad, around 2300 BCE, mentions ships from Meluha docking at his capital. Another mentions an interpreter for the Meluhan language. Imagine that, a translator fluent in both Akkadian and the tongue of Harappa, standing in a Mesopotamian court, negotiating prices for timber and lapis lazuli. But Mesopotamia was only one direction. Go north instead, through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, past the high valleys of Badakhshan, where the world's finest lapis lazuli glows blue in the rock. This deep blue stone was prized across the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs wore it. Mesopotamian priests ground it into pigment for sacred ceremonies, and the Indus people controlled its flow. Their trade outpost at Shortagai, far to the north in what is now Afghanistan, proves it. This wasn't a casual campsite. It was a full settlement, complete with Indus-style houses, Indus pottery, Indus seals. The people who lived there were colonists, managers, traders. They oversaw the extraction of lapis lazuli and sent it south in caravans. They also brought something else, the seeds of a plant that would change the world. Cotton. The earliest known cotton textiles in the world come from the Indus Valley. Fragments found at Mohenjo-Daro date to around 2500 BCE. The Mesopotamians called it Sindhu, a word that echoes the name of the river itself. They imported Indus cotton for centuries, marveling at its softness. Meanwhile, the Indus people took something from their northern neighbors too, tin. Mixed with copper, tin creates bronze, harder, sharper, more durable than pure copper. The Indus cities needed it for tools, weapons, and ornaments. Without tin, their Bronze Age would have been a Copper Age, and their civilization might have looked very different. Trade moved by land and by sea. On land, bullock carts creaked along dirt roads, their wooden wheels leaving ruts that still survive in some places. The carts carried grain, pottery, and people. They moved at walking speed, maybe 20 miles a day on good terrain. A journey from Harappa to the coast took 2 weeks or more. From the coast to Mesopotamia, by boat, took another month, depending on winds and currents. At sea, the ships were larger. Reed boats, sewn together with rope and coated in bitumen, could carry several tons of cargo. Some had sails. Others relied on oars and the seasonal monsoon winds. The traders knew these winds intimately. Summer winds blew from the southwest, pushing ships toward India. Winter winds reversed, blowing from the northeast, carrying vessels back toward the Gulf. Sailors timed their voyages to these rhythms, that leaving port when the wind turned favorable and waiting out the storms when it didn't. The sea routes connected to land routes at key ports. Lothal, in modern Gujarat, was one of the most important. Here, archaeologists found a massive dockyard, a rectangular basin lined with brick connected to the sea by a channel. Ships could enter, unload, and leave with the tide. Alongside the dock, they found warehouses, workshops, and a distinctive seal-making industry. Lothal was a gateway, a place where sea met land and goods changed hands. Its residents made beads, carved seals, and prepared goods for export. They lived well, ate well, and buried their dead with care. But trade wasn't just about raw materials, it was about craftsmanship. The Indus people transformed imported stones into finished products that commanded premium prices. Carnelian, a reddish-orange stone, arrived from Gujarat. Indus artisans drilled it, shaped it, polished it until it glowed like fire. They developed a technique called alkaline etching that allowed them to create white patterns on the red stone. These beads were so prized that they appear in royal tombs across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even as far as Greece. Lapis lazuli became beads, inlays, and amulets. Turquoise came from Iran. Silver arrived from somewhere in the west, perhaps Anatolia or the Caucasus. Gold, though rare, made its way from multiple sources. The Indus people worked all of them into objects of astonishing beauty. And what did they send in return? Their own products. cotton cloth, of course, beads and seals, ivory from elephants, perhaps timber from the Himalayan foothills. Some scholars think they also traded spices and aromatic woods, though the evidence is thinner for these perishable goods. The scale of this trade is hard to grasp. We're talking about a network that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to Central Asia, from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. It connected three great civilizations: the Indus, the Mesopotamian, and the Elamite in what is now Iran. These weren't casual contacts. They were sustained, organized, and vital to all parties. Consider the numbers. Mesopotamian texts mention Meluhan ships arriving regularly. Administrative records from Ur list goods received from Meluha: copper, carnelian, lapis lazuli, wood. One tablet lists over a ton of copper arriving in a single shipment. That's not a gift exchange. That's commerce. The Indus people built their trade on reliability. Their weights and measures were standardized, fired clay cubes in precise multiples of a base unit. A merchant in Harappa could trust that a weight from Mohenjo-Daro meant the same thing as one from his own city. This consistency made transactions easier and built trust across vast distances. They also built their trade on stability. The Indus cities show remarkably little evidence of warfare. No city walls with defensive towers, no mass graves from battles, no depictions of soldiers or conquests. Instead, their strength came from organization, from shared standards, from the quiet confidence of people who knew their systems worked. But all systems have breaking points. The trade networks that made the Indus civilization rich would also make it vulnerable. When climate shifted and the rivers changed course, when Mesopotamia's own troubles disrupted demand, when the monsoon patterns failed, the networks would falter. And when they failed, the cities that depended on them would begin to hollow out. But that's a story for another day. For now, picture this: a carnelian bead, drilled and polished, glowing deep red in the Mesopotamian sun. It rests in a merchant's hand. He doesn't know the name of the craftsman who made it. He doesn't know the city where it was shaped. He only knows its value, its beauty, and the long road it traveled to reach him. That bead carried the Indus world across mountains and seas, binding distant peoples into a web of exchange that would last for centuries. The water in the Great Bath came from rain and river, but the civilization that built it drew its lifeblood from roads and sea lanes, from caravans and cargo ships, from the steady pulse of goods moving hand to hand, city to city, world to world. That was the true current beneath the surface of Indus life, and it flowed in every direction. Farmers and merchants fashrai. Before the merchants could trade lapis lazuli across mountains, before the seals could stamp their stories onto clay, someone had to grow the food. The heart of it all was wheat and barley, the staples that sustained tens of thousands of people packed into mud brick cities. The Indus farmers also grew peas, lentils, chickpeas, sesame seeds, and dates. They cultivated cotton, making the Indus Valley one of the earliest regions in the world to spin and weave this fiber. They raised cattle, water buffalo, goats, sheep, and pigs. This was surplus agriculture, planned and executed on a scale that could support urban life. The Indus River and its tributaries carried silt from the mountains, and the annual floods left behind fresh, nutrient-rich soil. The farmers built their settlements along the riverbanks, close enough to benefit from the waters, but high enough to escape the worst of the flooding. The summer monsoon rains arrived with reliable consistency, soaking the ground just as the seeds needed moisture to sprout. The farmers worked with these rhythms, relying on the natural flood cycle and simple water management techniques, small channels, embankments, and reservoirs, rather than massive irrigation canals. That surplus created the space for specialists: potters who never touched a plow, bead makers who never planted a seed, metal workers who spent their days coaxing bronze from fire and ore. All of them depended on the farmer's abundance. This was the engine of the Indus economy: agriculture at the base, craftsmanship in the middle, and trade at the top. The merchants of the Indus cities were organized professionals, deeply embedded in the urban fabric. Their tools were precise. The Indus people developed standardized weights that were remarkably consistent across their entire territory. Small cubes of chert, carefully shaped and polished, formed a system that followed a ratio, from tiny fractions of a gram to several kilograms. This standardization meant that a merchant in Mohenjo-Daro could trade with a merchant in Harappa without argument. The scales did not lie. In many ancient societies, weights and measures were inconsistent, often manipulated for profit. The Indus system suggested a level of trust and regulation that was rare in the ancient world. Someone, whether a guild, a council, or a central authority, was enforcing these standards. The merchants also had their seals, small square pieces of steatite carved with intricate designs and inscriptions, each one unique and identifying its owner. When a merchant sent goods to another city, they would press their seal into a lump of wet clay attached to the package. The clay would dry, leaving an unmistakable mark. The seal was a signature, a guarantee, and a mark of responsibility. But the merchants were not just middlemen. They were also organizers of production. A merchant might import copper from distant mines, deliver it to a metalworker, and then sell the finished tools to farmers. The merchant stood at the center of a web that connected the fields to the forge to the marketplace. The markets themselves were lively places. Imagine the streets of Mohenjo-Daro on a busy morning, sunlight spilling over the rooftops, the smell of fresh bread and spices in the air. Merchants spread their wares on woven mats, pots of different sizes and colors, strings of beads in brilliant blues and greens, bronze tools with sharp edges, bolts of cotton cloth, baskets of grain, dried fish, and sweet dates. People came from all corners of the city. Farmers bringing their surplus, craftsmen bringing their latest pieces, families buying what they needed for the day. The exchange was not just economic, it was social, where news spread and the community came alive. Trade in the ancient world ran on trust. A merchant who cheated a customer would soon find themselves without customers. A merchant who delivered quality goods would build a reputation that traveled far. The seals helped, but the real currency was reliability. Beyond the city walls, the merchants organized the movement of goods along the rivers. Boats carried grain, timber, and stone up and down the Indus. Carts pulled by oxen creaked along the roads that connected the major settlements. The merchants knew the routes, the safe crossings, the places to rest and resupply. They knew which goods were scarce in which regions and where they could fetch the best price. The trade was not just local. The merchants connected to vast networks that reached Mesopotamia, Persia, and the lands beyond. They brought back copper, tin, precious stones, and exotic woods, and sent out finished goods, textiles, and beads. The Indus merchants were active, sophisticated participants in this global exchange. But the merchants could not exist without the farmers. The relationship was symbiotic, each side depending on the other. The agricultural calendar shaped everything. In late spring, the fields were prepared and the seeds scattered. The monsoon arrived in summer, bringing the rain that coaxed the shoots from the earth. Through the autumn, the crops grew and ripened under the warm sun. The harvest came in late autumn and early winter. Families worked together, cutting the grain, bundling it, carrying it to the threshing floors. The grain was beaten, winnowed, and stored in large ceramic jars or in granaries. The granaries themselves were impressive structures, large, raised platforms with rows of wooden or brick bins, built to keep the grain dry and protected from pests. Some sat near the river, making it easy to load the grain onto boats for transport. The sheer size of these structures suggested that they served not just individual families, but the entire community. Grain was wealth, stored, managed, and distributed with care. Life for the farmers was hard. They rose with the sun and worked until the light faded. They did not live in the grand houses of the city, but in smaller dwellings on the edges of the settlements or in the countryside. Yet their labor was the foundation upon which everything else rested. The merchants could trade, the craftsmen could create, all because the farmers produced more than they needed. The surplus was a gift that kept giving. It freed people from the land, allowed specialization and innovation, and built the cities. It was all made possible by a deep understanding of the natural world. The farmers watched the sky, read the rivers, and knew the soil, passing this knowledge from generation to generation. In the end, the story of the Indus Valley is the story of balance. The farmers and the merchants, the fields and the markets, the harvest and the trade, each depended on the other. The cities rose because the farmers fed them. The merchants thrived because the craftsmen produced. And together they created a civilization that still amazes us today. The sun sets over the fields. The grain is gathered. The weights are set. The seals are pressed. The cycle continues, steady and sure. Religion and ritual. And somewhere in between, the people of the Indus Valley shaped their understanding of the world beyond the visible one. Yet the evidence of their inner lives lies scattered in the dirt, in clay and stone, in small figures and strange symbols. The Indus people built with incredible skill, but they did not build monuments to their gods, at least not in any form we recognize. Instead, we find small things, tiny clay figurines, carved stones, symbols pressed into seals. These were the everyday objects of belief, not grand statements of power. The figures are small, usually female, with broad hips and elaborate headdresses. Early excavators saw them as fertility goddesses, but newer thinking questions this. Maybe these were toys, or figures used in household rituals or representations of specific women. What we can say is that these figures appear in almost every home excavated. If they were objects of devotion, then worship was a private household matter. The seals tell a different story. The unicorn appears most often, a mysterious one-horned creature that may have been a type of bull shown in profile. The humped bull is common too, often with a ritual object placed before it. Some scholars see this as an early form of bull worship. Others point out that the seals were likely used for trade and administration, the animals simply symbols of families or guilds. Then there is the swastika, one of the oldest religious symbols in the world. Its later misuse in the 20th century has made it difficult to discuss, but in its original setting, it was a positive mark, a sign of blessing. The swastika's presence suggests a symbolic language we have only begun to understand. The Indus people used geometric patterns and animal motifs in ways that clearly carried meaning, but that meaning is lost to us, locked inside a script we cannot read and a culture we can only glimpse. Perhaps the most intriguing evidence of ritual practice comes from the great cities themselves. Mohenjo-Daro contains the Great Bath, a large water tank built with remarkable precision. Steps lead down into the pool, changing rooms surround it. The entire structure speaks of ceremony, of purification, of cleansing. Water held deep meaning for these people. They built their cities along rivers, depended on monsoon rains, constructed elaborate drainage systems. Water was life, and it may also have been sacred. The Great Bath may have been a place of ritual bathing, a practice that continues in South Asia to this day. The impulse to cleanse the body and the spirit together runs deep in this region, and it may have roots in the Indus Valley. What other rituals might have taken place? At Kalibangan, a smaller Indus site, archaeologists found what appear to be fire pits arranged in a row. These may have been used for sacrifices or offerings. Some scholars have drawn tentative parallels to later Vedic fire rituals, though the thousand-year gap makes direct continuity impossible to prove. The Indus civilization ended around 1900 BCE. The Vedic texts were composed perhaps 1,000 years later. Drawing direct lines between them requires caution, yet the similarities warrant attention. Fire as a ritual tool appears across many ancient cultures. Whether the Indus people passed this practice forward or whether later societies simply arrived at similar ideas independently remains uncertain. The timing and geography make inheritance possible but not provable. The pipal tree also appears in Indus art. This large fig tree, with its distinctive heart-shaped leaves, would later become sacred in Buddhism and Hinduism. In Indus seals, we see figures seated beneath the branches of what may be a peepal tree, perhaps in a pose of meditation. One seal, known as the Pashupati seal, shows a figure seated cross-legged, surrounded by animals, wearing a horned headdress. His posture resembles later yoga positions. Some scholars see this as an early form of Shiva. Others see a generic figure, not connected to any later deity. What is clear is that the Indus people had a rich symbolic world, a visual language that carried deep meaning, even if we cannot fully translate it. We also find evidence of ancestor worship. Small human figurines, often broken, appear in household contexts. The Indus people buried their dead with pottery and ornaments, suggesting a belief in an afterlife. But the burials are simple. No great tombs, no elaborate grave goods. Death was treated with respect, but not with extravagance. This modesty extends to their entire approach to the divine. The Indus civilization built no monuments to glorify rulers, no temples to house their gods. Instead, they invested their resources in infrastructure, in water systems, in the comfort and health of their cities. Their religion, if we can call it that, seems to have been woven into everyday existence, expressed in small figures kept in homes, in seals carried for trade, in the water that flowed through their streets. We cannot know what they believed about the afterlife, which gods they prayed to, or if they had priests. The evidence is too thin, too fragmentary. But we can see the shape of their spiritual world. Beyond the grand and visible, it was grounded in nature, in animals and trees and water. It was practiced in homes and public baths, not in vast temples. The mother figurines suggest a reverence for creation and nurture. The animal seals suggest a respect for the natural world. The swastika suggests a belief in good fortune and cosmic order. The Great Bath suggests a value placed on purity and cleansing. These fragments paint a picture of a people who saw the sacred in the ordinary. They did not need towering monuments to feel the presence of the divine. They found it in their homes, in their fields, in the water that sustained them. As the sun sets over the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, the shadows lengthen across the Great Bath. The water is gone now, the rituals have ceased, but the stones remember. We may never know their prayers or understand their symbols fully, but we can honor their memory by recognizing the depth of their inner lives. They were not merely builders and traders and farmers. They were people who looked beyond the visible world, who sought meaning in the patterns of nature, who created rituals to mark the passage of life. That is a kind of wisdom we can still appreciate. In the quiet ruins, in the small clay figures, in the ancient symbol of the swastika, we glimpse a people who walked with the sacred in their midst. And that perhaps is enough. The mystery remains. But the mystery itself tells us something important. The human need for meaning, for connection to something greater, is ancient and universal. The people of the Indus Valley felt it. They expressed it in their own way, in their own time. And we, thousands of years later, can still feel its presence in the dust and the stone and the silence. Society and governance. In Mesopotamia, kings raised ziggurats and carved their names into stone for eternity. The Indus cities offer nothing like this. No royal inscriptions, no statues of rulers, no heroic reliefs showing a king smiting enemies. The seals that the Indus people carved show animals, trees, strange beings. They never show a single human figure in a pose of dominance. That silence is loud. So who ran these cities? This is where the evidence gets tricky, because the evidence is mostly absence, and absence is hard to interpret. Some scholars point to the Great Bath, a structure so large, so carefully built, so clearly central to the life of Mohenjo-Daro. It required planning. It required resources. It required labor organized over time. Who ordered it built? Who decided where it would sit? The bath suggests a priestly class, a group that managed ritual life and held authority through religious duty. Water was sacred to the Indus people. Their homes show a deep care for cleanliness. Bathing platforms, drains, wells. A society that valued purity might well have elevated those who guarded the rituals of purification. The priest-king theory has a long history. It remains possible, but it rests on guesswork. Others see merchants. The Indus civilization was built on trade. Their goods traveled far. Their seals were used to mark ownership and to track goods. A merchant class would have needed organization. They would have needed standards for weights and measures. They would have needed trust. And the remarkable thing is, they had it. The weights are uniform across the entire civilization. From the smallest bead to the largest stone, the system holds. This consistency suggests a powerful commercial class, a group that enforced standards, a group that wrote the rules of exchange. Maybe they ran the cities. Maybe the cities were in effect corporations, places built to serve the machinery of trade. Still others see a council of elders. The absence of a single ruler might mean rule by many. The grid layout suggests planning, but planning can come from a committee as easily as from a king. The uniformity of bricks and weights suggests coordination. But coordination can spring from shared culture rather than top-down command. The Indus people may have governed themselves through consensus, through assemblies of the wise, through a system that kept power dispersed to prevent anyone from seizing too much. There is a fragment of a stone statue from Mohenjo-Daro, a bearded man. His eyes are half closed, his lips are pressed together. He wears a headband and a robe with a trefoil pattern. Some called him a priest-king. Others call him simply a man. The statue is small. It was found broken. It tells us almost nothing. Yet it is the closest thing we have to a face of authority. And even that face looks inward, not outward, meditative, not commanding. The lack of a clear ruler troubles our modern minds. We want a story. We want to know who was in charge. But the Indus people did not leave us that story. Maybe they did not think in those terms. Maybe their idea of power was different from ours. Power might have been shared. It might have been invisible. It might have flowed through the community rather than sitting on top of it. Look at the public buildings, the granaries, the baths, the assembly halls. They exist, but they are not grand. They are practical. They serve the needs of the people rather than the glory of a ruler. The Great Bath is impressive, yes, but it is also functional. It holds water. It lets people cleanse themselves. It does not shout. It simply stands. The homes tell a similar story. They are built of the same bricks as the public buildings. No special material for the powerful. No marble. No gold. The rich and the poor use the same mud bricks, the same plaster, the same timber. The difference between a large house and a small house is a matter of degree, not of kind. This is a society that did not celebrate hierarchy. It managed to be complex without being stratified in the way we expect. The lack of weapons matters too. Very few swords, very few spears, very few signs of organized violence. The Indus cities had walls, but the walls seem built to hold back floodwaters, not enemies. The gates are simple. There are no towers for archers, no defensive works aimed at a human foe. This was not a society that expected war. It was a society that expected cooperation. So what can we say with confidence? We can say that the Indus people valued order. We can say that they valued cleanliness. We can say that they valued consistency. We can say that they did not value the display of individual power. We can say that their cities worked. For 700 years, they worked. That kind of longevity does not come from chaos. It comes from a system that solved problems, a system that kept people fed and housed and safe, a system that did not need to write its own name in stone to prove it existed. Maybe the answer to our question is that the Indus people did not need a king. They did not need a priest. They did not need a merchant council. They needed each other. Their society ran on shared values, on a common understanding of how things should be done, on the quiet agreement that the street will stay straight, the brick will stay uniform, the drain will stay clean. That is governance, not by decree, by culture. The priest-king statue sits in a museum now. His face is calm, his eyes are closed, he seems to be waiting, or maybe he is simply resting. He does not tell us who ruled. He does not tell us who decided the grid, or set the brick ratio, or designed the Great Bath. He just sits. A reminder that some questions have no easy answers, that some societies chose to be governed by something other than a ruler, that order can come from within. The Indus people built cities that outlasted their memory. They built systems that worked without monuments. They built a society that we still cannot fully explain. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the Indus civilization teaches us that power does not need a face, that a society can thrive without a throne, that the quiet machinery of daily life can hold a civilization together more firmly than any king. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro still lie where they were laid. The bricks still hold their ratio, the drains still run straight. The city waits for us to understand it, and in its silence, it speaks. It tells us that governance is not always about who rules. Sometimes it is about how people agree to live, and the people of the Indus agreed for centuries to live in a way that left no trace of rulers, only traces of order, only traces of care, only traces of a society that found a different way to be. Decline begins. The cities had stood for 1,000 years. That alone was remarkable. But nothing lasts forever, not even the great cities of the Indus. The signs were subtle at first, a shift in the wind, a river that moved, the earth itself, restless beneath their feet. For generations, the Indus people had enjoyed a stable world. Monsoon rains came like clockwork. Rivers rose and fell in gentle rhythm. Fields yielded their bounty year after year. But around 1900 BCE, that rhythm began to break. The monsoon is a fickle partner. It gives life. It can also take it away. The Indus cities depended on those rains. When the monsoon weakened, the rivers weakened too. Less rain meant smaller floods. Smaller floods meant less fertile soil. Less fertile soil meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant hungry people. Scientists have studied ancient pollen grains from the region. They found a story written in dust. Grasslands were drying out, forests were thinning. The green landscape of the Indus era was slowly turning to scrub. The climate was changing, and the people could do nothing to stop it. But the sky was not the only force at work. The earth itself was shifting. The Indus Valley sits on a restless planet. Tectonic plates grind against each other far below the surface. Sometime around this period, the ground began to move, not in dramatic earthquakes, though those did occur, but in slower, more patient ways. The land tilted. Rivers changed course. The Gagar-Hakra river system, which fed many settlements, began to dry up. Some scholars believe tectonic uplift diverted its waters. Others point to the weakening monsoon. Either way, the result was the same. The water went elsewhere. The people stayed, and they suffered. Water was everything. It was drink, food, transport, trade. Without it, the cities could not breathe. As rivers shrank and disappeared, the great urban centers began to starve. Not just for food, but for purpose. A city without water is a city without a future. Mohenjo-Daro felt it first. The city had grown enormous by ancient standards. Perhaps 50,000 people called it home. All those mouths needed feeding. All those homes needed water. The wells that served the city began to run low. The streets that once bustled with traders grew quieter. Harappa fared little better. The city had its own struggles. Its position along the Ravi River gave it access to water, but that water was becoming unreliable. The floods that once enriched the soil now came at the wrong times. Or not at all. The countryside suffered too. Villages depended on the cities depended on the villages. When one weakened, the other followed. It was a web of mutual need, and the web was coming apart. Trade routes began to falter. The long roads to Mesopotamia, once filled with merchants and their goods, grew empty. Fewer caravans meant fewer resources. Fewer resources meant less wealth. Less wealth meant less power. The cities could no longer command the vast networks they once dominated. What happened next is a matter of debate. Some scholars see signs of violence. Skeletons found at Mohenjo-Daro show injuries that might have come from conflict. But these discoveries are scattered, not widespread. They tell of isolated incidents, not war. The picture is murky. The truth is hard to read from bones and broken walls. There were probably internal tensions too. 1,000 years is a long time. Rulers come and go. People grow restless. When resources shrink, conflicts grow. It happens in all societies. The Indus cities were no different, but the decline was not sudden. It was slow, painfully slow. Generation by generation, the cities lost their luster. Buildings fell into disrepair. Streets were not cleaned as often. New construction almost stopped entirely. The great public works, the drainage systems, the baths, all began to show their age. The people adapted, as people do. They moved away in small groups. Families packed their belongings and left. Some went east toward the Ganges Plains. Others went south to the Indian Peninsula. They carried their skills, their tools, their memories, but they did not carry their cities. Those who stayed made do with less. They built smaller homes over the ruins of larger ones. They reused old bricks. They lived among the bones of their ancestors' achievements. It was not a collapse. It was a long, slow fade. The environment continued to change. The rivers kept moving. The rains kept weakening. The land that had once supported a great civilization could no longer do so. The cities had been miracles of human ingenuity, but miracles require conditions to sustain them. Those conditions were gone. By 1700 BC, the great cities were shadows of themselves. Mohenjo-Daro was largely abandoned. Harappa hung on a while longer, but its best days were far behind. The population had scattered. The trade networks had collapsed. The writing system, once so widespread, fell out of use. People stopped making seals. The workshops fell silent. There was no dramatic ending. No single day when the cities fell. No invading army at the gates. The Indus civilization simply wore down. Like a cloth washed too many times, it grew thin. And then it tore. The people did not disappear. They merged with other groups. They carried their knowledge with them. Their genes spread across the subcontinent. Their traditions seeded new cultures. But the cities, the great monuments, the mighty civilization itself were lost. For centuries after, the ruins sat silent. Dust covered the streets. The great bath filled with silt. The grid of lanes and alleys became home to snakes and scrub. The world moved on. New peoples arrived. New cultures rose. The Indus cities became memory. And then even memory faded. No one remembered the great civilization that had once thrived there. No one knew that beneath their feet lay the bones of an empire. The rivers kept shifting, the sands kept shifting. The secret of the Indus people slept in the earth. It would take 4,000 years for the world to find them again, and when it did, it would find only fragments, pieces of a puzzle that still resists solution. A civilization that ended not with a bang, but with a sigh. The decline began with changes no one could control. Climate, geology, the slow movements of a restless world. The people did what they could. They adapted, they moved, they survived, but their cities could not. And so the great experiment of the Indus came to its quiet end, not through conquest, not through disaster, but through the patient, relentless forces of a changing world. The rivers shifted, the rains failed, and the cities, built to last forever, learned that nothing does. The end of an era. The Indus and its many tributaries brought water to their fields, carried their boats to distant ports, and sustained the largest cities the world had ever known. The great floods that had always been a seasonal hazard now became something worse, unpredictable, destructive, and devastating when they struck. Mohenjo-Daro felt it first. Built on the flat plains of Sind, it relied on its remarkable drainage systems and raised platforms to stay dry. But the rivers were shifting course now, and no amount of careful planning could hold back the changing landscape. The Indus, restless and powerful, began to move. Its channels wandered across the floodplain, sometimes abandoning the areas where people had built their homes. The docks at Mohenjo-Daro, once vital connections to distant markets, slowly became useless as the river retreated. Nothing about the decline of the Indus civilization was sudden. Instead, it was a slow, creeping process that took generations to unfold. The city that had once teemed with merchants, craftsmen, and families gradually became quieter. Streets that had bustled with activity now echoed with emptiness. But even as Mohenjo-Daro faded, other cities carried on. Harappa to the north continued to thrive for a while longer. Its position along the Ravi River gave it advantages that Mohenjo-Daro had lost. The city remained a center of trade and craft, its workshops still producing the fine pottery, beads, and seals that had made the Indus people famous. Yet Harappa, too, was changing. The trade networks that had once stretched from Mesopotamia to Central Asia were weakening. The great commercial routes that had carried Indus goods to distant lands were becoming less profitable. The merchants who had once sailed to the Persian Gulf or trekked through mountain passes now found fewer buyers for their wares. Economic decline followed environmental change. It was a devastating combination. The cities began to shrink, neighborhoods were abandoned, the grand structures that had defined these urban centers were left to crumble. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, once the heart of the city's ceremonial life, was eventually filled in and built over. The sophisticated drainage system, so carefully engineered, fell into disrepair. People adapted as best they could. They moved to smaller settlements scattered across the countryside. They returned to farming, living in villages that were simpler but more sustainable. The urban way of life that had defined the Indus civilization for nearly 1,000 years was slowly unraveling. But the story was not the same everywhere. In the western reaches of the civilization, in places like Dholavira and Lothal, the decline took a different shape. Lothal, with its famous dockyard, continued to function as a port for some time. But as trade with Mesopotamia declined, the city's importance faded. The workshops that had produced thousands of beads and seals gradually went silent. Dholavira, built on an island in the Rann of Kutch, faced its own challenges. The region was always harsh, with extreme temperatures and limited water. The city's residents had developed remarkable water conservation systems, but even these could not withstand the changing climate. As the monsoon weakened, the reservoirs that sustained the city began to dry up. The people of Dholavira held on for as long as they could. They repaired their walls, maintained their reservoirs, and continued their rituals. But eventually, the resources ran out. The city was abandoned, its inhabitants scattering to find better conditions elsewhere. By around 1800 BCE, the great cities were largely empty. Mohenjo-Daro, once home to perhaps 40,000 people, was a ghost town. Harappa, though it lingered longer, was a shadow of its former self. What had happened? The old theories spoke of invasion. Historians once imagined Aryan warriors sweeping down from the north, destroying the cities and enslaving the people. But modern archaeology has found no evidence of such conquest. No mass graves, no signs of burning, no weapons of war. The truth is more complex and more human. The Indus civilization collapsed because its foundation had eroded. Climate change weakened the monsoon. Rivers shifted their courses. The trade networks that had sustained the cities fell apart. And when these systems failed, the cities could no longer support their populations. The people did not disappear. They did not flee in panic or perish in battle. Instead, they did what people have always done when faced with hardship. They adapted. They moved to the countryside, where they could farm and raise animals. They built smaller settlements, more resilient and self-sufficient. They abandoned the grand urban experiment of their ancestors and returned to a simpler way of life. The transformation was gradual, spanning centuries. And as the Indus people dispersed, their culture did not vanish entirely. It merged with other traditions, other peoples, other ways of living. In the centuries that followed, new cultures emerged in the region. The painted gray ware culture appeared in the Ganges Valley with its distinctive pottery and iron tools. The cemetery H culture arose in the Punjab, developing new burial practices and artistic styles. These cultures were different from the Indus civilization. They were less urban, less centralized, less sophisticated in some ways, but they carried within them the echoes of what had come before. The seeds of the Indus people had been scattered across the land, and they would grow in new forms. The great cities were gone. The seals were no longer carved. The script was no longer written. The baths were no longer filled. The granaries stood empty and roofless. But the land was not empty. Life continued, as it always does. By around 1300 BCE, the last traces of the Indus cities had faded. The bricks of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were scavenged by later peoples, reused in new construction. The great platforms were covered by earth and vegetation. The cities became mounds, silent and still, waiting for the archaeologists who would not come for another 3,000 years. The people who lived in the region during these final centuries did not know they were living in the aftermath of something extraordinary. They did not know that beneath their feet lay the remains of the largest civilization the world had yet seen. They simply lived their lives, as people do. The Indus civilization did not end with a bang. It did not end with dramatic battles or heroic last stands. It ended with a whimper, with a slow fading, with a gradual letting go. The monsoon weakened, the rivers moved, the trade dried up, the cities emptied, and the people, resilient and adaptable, moved on. They carried with them their knowledge of farming, of pottery, of bead making. They carried their traditions and their beliefs. They carried the memory of great cities, though that memory would fade with each passing generation. The rivers continued to flow, though they no longer flowed past the great cities. The land continued to be farmed, though by different hands. And the mounds, covered in grass and dust, held the secrets of a lost world. The end of an era had come, but the story was not over. It was merely waiting to be told again, thousands of years later, by people who would wonder at the achievements of those who had come before. Legacy in the shadows. Later cultures of the subcontinent would continue to honor female divinities, the worship of the mother goddess, the reverence for fertility. These threads run deep beneath the surface of history, connecting the ancient cities to the temples of a later age. The people tree. The sacred fig. In Indus seals, we see it depicted with care. In later India, it becomes the Bodhi tree, under which the Buddha finds enlightenment. The continuity is not accidental. It is the slow, patient flow of culture through time. Then there is the symbol that would become one of the most controversial in human history, the swastika. In the ruins of Harappa, archaeologists found it carved into seals and pottery. For the Indus people, it was a simple solar symbol, a sign of good fortune, a mark of the turning sun. It would travel far beyond the Indus Valley, east into China and Japan, where it remains a temple symbol today, west into Europe, where it would be twisted into something dark and terrible. But in its origin, it was simply a wish for light, a hope for luck, a small, everyday charm. The legacy of the Indus also lies in what later people rejected. The cities were orderly, planned, uniform. The later villages of the subcontinent were more organic, more varied, more shaped by local needs than by central authority. Perhaps this was a conscious turning away. Perhaps it was simply what survived when the great organizing force of the cities collapsed. Either way, the contrast tells us something about what the Indus civilization was. It was an experiment in order, an experiment that ended. But its shadows lingered in the landscape. Trade routes outlived the cities. The paths that Indus merchants had carved across mountains and deserts remained. Later peoples walked those same paths, carrying different goods, speaking different languages. But the roads themselves were a gift, a map written in worn stone and beaten earth. The measurement systems left their mark too. The Indus people had standardized weights, small cubes of chert, carefully shaped, remarkably uniform. Later traders in the subcontinent used similar systems. The influence is not direct. It is more like a river that changes course but continues to water the same fields. In the villages of Sindh and Punjab, folk traditions preserved fragments of the old ways, pottery techniques, bead-making methods, the use of certain colors and patterns. These were not taught as heritage. They were just how things were done, how they had always been done, as far as anyone knew. The great silence of the Indus script meant that no one could read the thoughts of those ancient people. No one could hear their voices, but their hands spoke through their works. And those works passed from hand to hand, down through the centuries, like a message in a bottle that no one could open, but everyone could feel. The British, when they arrived in the subcontinent, found a land of extraordinary complexity, ancient traditions, deep philosophies, elaborate arts. They did not know that beneath their feet lay the ruins of a civilization more ancient than their own. When the discovery came, in the 1920s, it changed everything. The history of India suddenly extended backward by millennia. The subcontinent had not been a latecomer to civilization. It had been among the first. But the people themselves had never needed the discovery. Their ancestors had carried the legacy forward without knowing it. The knowledge was in their fields, in their festivals, in their crafts, in the way they measured grain and built their homes and honored their gods. The legacy also survived in the landscape itself. The great rivers continued to flow, the monsoon continued to come, the land remembered its old masters, the cities were gone, but the relationship between the people and the land had been shaped by centuries of Indus stewardship. The terraces, the wells, the field patterns, these endured. When later kingdoms rose in India, they built on foundations they did not understand, the Mauryas, the Guptas, the great dynasties of the north. They thought they were creating something new. In a way, they were. But they were also continuing something ancient, the idea of a unified subcontinent, the practice of long-distance trade, the integration of diverse peoples under a common culture. These were Indus ideas. Indus achievements. Indus gifts. The silence of the Indus civilization is part of its legacy. Because they left no readable records, they cannot be claimed by any single group. They belong to everyone. And therefore, they belong to no one. This has allowed their legacy to flow into all the cultures of the subcontinent without conflict, without division, without the bitter arguments that follow the claims of exclusive inheritance. Their gods, if they had gods, are gone. Their kings, if they had kings, are nameless. Their language, if they had a single language, is unreadable. What remains is something more basic, more fundamental, the shape of a pot, the weight of a stone, the plan of a city, the practice of a craft. These are the true legacies, not the grand gestures of history, but the small, persistent habits of daily life. In the villages of modern Pakistan and India, women still grind grain between stones. The stones are not exactly the same as those of the Indus people, but they are close. The motion is the same. The patience is the same. The rhythm of the work is the same. There is a kind of immortality in this, not of the body, but of the practice. The children who play in the ruins of Harappa do not know they are playing on the bones of a lost world. They see only mounds and broken bricks. They chase goats across the ancient streets. They swim in the canals that once watered the great city. The past is not a monument to them. It is simply the ground they walk on. This is perhaps the deepest legacy of all. The Indus civilization did not end. It dissolved. It seeped into the soil. It became part of the land itself, and the land in turn became part of the people. The connection is invisible, but it is real. It is in the genes, in the customs, in the stories told around fires that have been burning in this region for thousands of years. The modern discovery of the Indus civilization has changed how the descendants of its people see themselves. There is pride now, a sense of depth, a feeling that the story of the subcontinent is longer and richer than anyone had imagined. But the people did not need the discovery to carry the legacy. They had been carrying it all along, without knowing, without naming, without claiming. The legacy in the shadows is the most powerful kind. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply endures in the fields, in the homes, in the hands of the people, waiting for the day when the shadows would lift and the light of history would fall once more on the cities that had never truly died. The Aryan question. The old Aryan invasion theory cast a long shadow over Indian identity. It made their ancestors the victims of conquest. It made their culture borrowed, imported, secondhand, and so scholars fought back, not with ideology, but with evidence. The first cracks appeared in the 1920s. When archaeologists began excavating Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, they found something unexpected. The cities showed no signs of sudden destruction. There were no thick layers of ash from fires, no mass graves, no weapon marks on bones. The bodies found scattered in the streets were not battle casualties. They were people who died of disease or old age, left unburied as communities slowly emptied and moved. And then there was the dating. The Indus civilization flourished from about 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. That made it far older than the Vedas, which were composed around 1500 BCE at the earliest. The math didn't work. A violent invasion cannot destroy cities already abandoned for centuries. The evidence kept mounting. Skeletons once cited as proof of massacre were re-examined under closer scrutiny. They bore no sword wounds, no signs of violence. The theory of a sudden, brutal conquest began to fracture. But what happened instead? The answer lay not in ruins, but in nature itself, in the changing course of rivers, in the shifting patterns of monsoon rains, in the slow, grinding forces of climate and time. The decline of the Indus cities was not a single catastrophic event. It was a slow unraveling across centuries. The monsoon patterns began to shift, rains became less reliable, the great rivers that fed the civilization started to change course. The Ghaggar-Hakra system, possibly the legendary Saraswati River, began to dry up. The land grew drier. Harvests shrank. The cities, built on surplus grain, could no longer sustain themselves. One by one, they emptied. The people didn't perish. They didn't flee in panic. They simply packed their possessions and moved. They traveled east toward the Ganges Plain, where rivers still flowed. They journeyed south into the Deccan Plateau. They merged with other communities. They carried forward their crafts, their customs, their memories. Here is where the story shifts. The Aryans did exist, but the model of invasion has given way to something different in most scholarly work today. Researchers increasingly favor a picture of gradual migration rather than conquest. Slowly, over generations, small groups of pastoralists from the steppes moved into the subcontinent. They brought horses, chariots, and a new language. They arrived not as conquerors sweeping aside opposition, but as settlers moving into territories. They encountered a land full of culture and people. They intermarried with local groups, they traded, they adapted to new circumstances. The Vedas, once read as conquest narratives, are now interpreted differently. The battles described were likely skirmishes between regional groups, not campaigns against a unified empire. The forts that Indra destroyed in these texts were probably small wooden structures, easily built and burned, not the massive brick walls of Mohenjo-Daro. The genetic evidence suggests a similar picture. Modern South Asians carry DNA from both the ancient Indus people and the steppe populations. The two groups mixed gradually over centuries, according to current ancient DNA research. This pattern points toward a process of admixture, rather than a single violent replacement event, though the full social dynamics of this contact remain uncertain and debated among specialists. The Aryan invasion theory was not merely wrong. It was a projection of European colonial thinking onto ancient history. It assumed civilizations could only transform through conquest. It assumed people were passive, unable to adapt, trade, or migrate peacefully. It flattened the complexity of human movement and cultural change. Today, the theory has been largely set aside by mainstream scholarship, but its legacy clings on. The word Aryan itself carries weight from its distortion in 20th century ideology. It bears a burden never intended for it, yet the fundamental questions remain. Who were the Indus people? What happened to them? Where did they go? The answer resists simplicity. The Indus civilization did not vanish, it transformed. Its people didn't disappear into history, they became ancestors to millions across South Asia. They carried forward their knowledge of farming, city building, and craft into new lands. They established new communities, new cultures, new tongues. The story of the Indus Valley reads as resilience rather than tragedy. It shows adaptation. It demonstrates how a sophisticated civilization facing a changing world didn't collapse inward, but instead dispersed outward and evolved. The cities emptied, but the people survived. Their genetic heritage flows through modern populations. Their traditions echo in temples and festivals. Their legacy lives not in brick and stone, but in blood and memory. Yet mystery persists. The script remains undeciphered. The language unknown. The people nameless to us. We call them the Indus civilization, but their own name for themselves is lost. Their gods, rulers, and poets exist beyond our reach. We possess only their ruins, seals, and toys. The Aryan question was once the burning mystery of Indian history. Now it serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that theories shift as evidence accumulates. That interpretation changes. That history unfolds not as simple conquest and fall, but as layered cause and effect. The Indus people did not succumb to invaders. They yielded to climate, to shifting rivers, to the inexorable forces of nature reshaping their world. Their example teaches us that civilizations rest on delicate foundations. They depend on fragile balances of weather, resources, and trade networks. When those balances fracture, even the greatest cities empty. Even mighty centers can fade. But the people endure. They adapt, they move, they transform. And through this movement, they carry civilization forward, not as architecture or monuments, but as knowledge and memory embedded in communities. The Indus people did not disappear. They became something new. Their story, once buried beneath layers of theory and misinterpretation, is only now emerging into light. The invasion narrative was a story we told ourselves for generations, a story centered on conflict. But the actual story runs quieter. It moves at the pace of family groups crossing plains. It marks the slow blending of peoples and languages. It speaks of those who faced environmental change and chose adaptation over collapse. The cities fell silent, but the people moved on. They mixed, they built again, and within their DNA, their languages, their continuing traditions, the Indus civilization persists. The Aryan question yields no single answer. Perhaps that matters less than the questions it continues to spark. The past is not a puzzle demanding final solution. It is a landscape demanding patient exploration, a terrain full of surprises where each answer opens new paths of inquiry. The Indus Valley, with its silent ruins and unread script, remains one of the most compelling landscapes in all of human history. Modern discoveries. Modern discoveries. The map of the ancient world had a blank space for centuries. For decades after the first digs at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, the story seemed simple enough. The textbooks settled into a comfortable rhythm. Indus civilization, 2500 to 1900 BCE, 2 major sites, maybe a few smaller settlements scattered around. As survey teams fanned out across the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, they kept finding more. Today, over 1,000 Indus sites have been identified. Rocky Gari spans over 300 hectares, bigger than Mohenjo-Daro, bigger than Harappa. Even the water systems of Dholavira speak to a sophistication we never suspected. The city had a series of reservoirs carved into the living rock that channeled monsoon rains into massive storage basins. One of them is the size of a large swimming pool. The engineering required to plan and build these systems, to calculate runoff, to design channels, to coordinate labor across seasons, is staggering. And Dholavira was not alone in its water wisdom. Across the Indus world, recent surveys have revealed a civilization obsessed with managing water. Step wells, rainwater harvesting, complex networks of channels and reservoirs. In a land where the monsoon could be generous one year and cruel the next, the Indus people built resilience into the very stones of their cities. Meanwhile, in the western reaches of the civilization, another revolution was underway. For years, scholars had assumed the Indus people were mostly river people, staying close to the Indus and its tributaries. Then came discovery after discovery that pushed the edges of their world outward. In the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, in a region called Shordugai, archaeologists found an Indus trading post. The people there were not just passing through. They had settled, built homes, and brought their seals and weights with them. They were mining lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone prized across the ancient world, and shipping it back to the cities of the plains. To the south, along the coast of Gujarat, more sites emerged. Lothal, Dholavira's sister port, Sutkagandur on the Makran coast. These were not mere villages. They had docks, warehouses, and the kind of organized planning that speaks to a central authority coordinating trade across hundreds of kilometers. The Indus civilization, it turns out, had a reach that spanned over 1 million square kilometers, larger than ancient Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia, a true giant of the ancient world hiding in plain sight. But perhaps the most humbling lesson of the recent discoveries is how much remains unknown. At Rakhigarhi, only a fraction of the site has been excavated. The same is true at Dholavira, at Mohenjo-Daro, at Harappa. The earth still holds its secrets. Archaeologists estimate that less than 10% of known Indus sites have been properly studied. The rest wait, patient as always, for funding, for time, for the right questions. New technologies are helping. Satellite imagery has revealed the traces of ancient riverbeds, showing that the Gagar-Hakra system, often linked to the legendary Saraswati River, once flowed far more strongly than it does today. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped buried structures without disturbing them. Drone surveys have photographed entire landscapes, picking out patterns invisible from the ground. Each tool adds a new layer. Each layer complicates the story. The image that emerges from these modern discoveries is not of a single uniform civilization. It is of a web, a network of cities and towns and villages, connected by rivers and trade routes, sharing a common culture but adapting to local conditions. Rakhigarhi is different from Dholavira. Dholavira is different from Harappa, and yet they clearly spoke the same cultural language. They used the same weights, they carved the same seals, they built with the same sense of order. This was not a monolithic empire with a single king. It was something subtler and in many ways more impressive, a civilization held together not by force but by shared values, shared practices, shared ways of seeing the world. The new discoveries have also changed how scholars think about the civilization's rise. The old story went like this. Around 2500 BCE, the Indus people suddenly developed cities. Before that, they were simple villagers. The transition was abrupt, almost magical. The new story is slower, more organic. Excavations at sites like Purana and Kunal, both in India, have pushed the origins of settled life in the region back to around 7500 BCE. That is not a typo. 7,500 years before the present. These early farmers were growing wheat and barley, raising cattle, and making pottery long before the first brick of Mohenjo-Daro was laid. The cities did not appear from nowhere. They were the culmination of thousands of years of gradual development, of learning to read the rivers, to coax food from the soil, to trade with neighbors, to build communities that could survive the whims of the monsoon. The Indus Valley Civilization was not a sudden miracle. It was an inheritance, built up slowly, generation by generation, and it was not alone in the world it inhabited. The recent discoveries have revealed a civilization deeply connected to its neighbors. Seals from the Indus region have been found in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian texts mention a place called Meluha, which many scholars now believe referred to the Indus cities. The trade was not occasional. It was systematic, organized, sustained across centuries. The people of the Indus were not isolated. They were participants in a global network that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. They were part of the ancient world's first age of globalization. Perhaps the most moving discovery came from a small site in India called Farmana. There, excavators found a burial ground with dozens of graves. The bodies were laid out with care, accompanied by pottery and ornaments. Analysis of the bones revealed something unexpected. The people had eaten a varied diet, with some individuals showing evidence of rice, others of millet, others of wheat. They had different food traditions, different ways of life, yet they were buried together in the same cemetery. This was not a society of strangers. It was a community of people who had come from different backgrounds, different regions, and had made a life together. Diversity was not a problem for the Indus people. It was a strength. As the sun sets over the plains of Haryana, the mounds of rocky Gari cast long shadows. A farmer guides his oxen through a field nearby. The rhythm of rural life continues as it has for millennia on soil that once supported one of the greatest civilizations in human history. The discoveries keep coming. Each year brings new finds, new surprises, new questions. The story of the Indus Valley Civilization is being rewritten in real time, and the people doing the rewriting are not just scholars in universities. They are the descendants of the very people they study. Modern South Asians, connected to the past through blood, through soil, through the enduring patterns of daily life. The blank space on the map is gone now. In its place is a rich, complex, living picture of a civilization that was bigger, smarter, and more sophisticated than anyone imagined, and the digging has only just begun. The Indus script enigma. This idea gained some traction in the 1960s when a few scholars suggested that the Indus people simply never developed true writing, but most researchers rejected this view. The symbols appear in regular patterns. Certain signs cluster together in predictable ways. The sequences show the kind of structure that language produces. If this was not writing, it was something so close to writing that the distinction hardly mattered. Others tried to read the script as a form of Dravidian, the language family that includes Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada. The logic here was geographical and historical. The Dravidian languages are spoken today mostly in southern India, but there is evidence that they were once widespread across the subcontinent. Some scholars believe the Indus people spoke an early Dravidian language, pushed south by later migrations. This theory has produced the most sustained attempts at decipherment. A computer scientist named Iravath Mahadevan spent decades analyzing the script, building a corpus of all known inscriptions, and developing statistical models of how the symbols combine. His work revealed real structure. Certain signs tend to appear at the beginning of inscriptions, others at the end. Some sequences are highly formulaic, suggesting standardized phrases. Mahadevan's conclusion was that the script represents an early Dravidian language. He proposed readings for some signs and argued that the inscriptions were mostly names and titles, perhaps records of trade or property. But his decipherment, too, has not been universally accepted. The problem is that the texts are so short. Without longer passages, without repeated contexts, it is hard to prove that any proposed reading is correct. A decipherment that works for a handful of seals will often fail for the next one. In the 1990s, a new voice entered the conversation. A scholar named Asko Parpola, working in Finland, took a different approach. Parpola is a linguist with deep knowledge of the Dravidian language family, and he had spent decades studying the Indus script. His method combines statistical analysis with comparative linguistics, looking for patterns that might match the grammar and vocabulary of reconstructed Proto-Dravidian. Parpola proposed that the script was logosyllabic, a system in which some signs stand for whole words and others stand for sounds. He identified what he believed were signs for fish, star, and god, and he used these to build a reading system. His work is considered the most rigorous attempt so far, and his book on the subject is a landmark in the field. And yet even Parpola's decipherment has not won universal acceptance. The signs are too few, the texts too short, and the gaps in our knowledge too large. Every proposed reading faces the same objection. How can you be sure? Then came the computers in the early 2000s. A team of researchers from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai used statistical methods to analyze the script structure. They compared the Indus symbols to known writing systems and to non-writing symbol systems, looking for mathematical signatures that might settle the question. Their conclusion caused a stir. The Indus script, they argued, was not writing at all. It was a system of symbols that carried meaning but did not encode language, something like the symbols on modern road signs or corporate logos. This claim was met with fierce opposition. Other researchers pointed out that the statistical methods were too crude, that the comparison with known scripts was flawed, and that the conclusion went against decades of careful analysis. The debate became heated. Papers were published, rebuttals were written, and the question of whether the script was writing remained unresolved. But the computer models did reveal something important. The script has a structure that is neither random nor purely pictorial. It follows rules. It has grammar, in a sense, even if that grammar does not match any known language. The symbols are arranged in ways that suggest meaning, purpose, and intent.
Ha, today.
The decipherment of the Indus script remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of archaeology. It sits alongside the Phaistos disc and the Voynich manuscript as a mystery that has resisted every attempt at solution. And the stakes are high. If the script is ever deciphered, it would transform our understanding of the Indus civilization. We would learn their names, their rulers, their religious beliefs, their own account of their history. We would hear their voices directly across 4,000 years. We might learn what they called their cities. We might learn how they organized their society. We might learn whether they had kings or priests or councils. We might learn why their civilization declined from their own mouths rather than from our guesses. The implications would reach far beyond the Indus Valley. A decipherment would illuminate the history of writing itself, showing how a script develops and evolves. It would connect the Indus civilization to the broader family of ancient cultures, revealing links that we can only guess at now, and it would settle the question of who the Indus people were, linguistically and culturally. This is why the decipherment is so contested. It is not just a scholarly puzzle, it is a matter of identity, heritage, and pride. But here's the hard truth. The script may never be deciphered. The texts are too short, the language is unknown, and there is no Rosetta Stone. Some scholars believe the script will remain a mystery forever, a closed door that we can only peer through from the outside. Others hold out hope. New inscriptions are still being found. New statistical methods are being developed. Artificial intelligence is being applied to the problem with algorithms that can detect patterns invisible to the human eye. Some researchers believe that a breakthrough is possible, if not in our lifetime, then in the next generation. There is something deeply human about this pursuit. We have an instinct to understand, to decode, to make sense of the marks that others have left behind. The Indus people wrote something down, and we want to know what it was. We want to hear their voices, even if they are faint. And so the seals sit in museum cases, their tiny figures frozen in stone. The unicorn faces us, patient and silent. The bull lowers its head, caught in a moment of stillness. The symbols march across the surface in neat rows, each one a question, each one a possibility. We have not cracked the code, but we have not stopped trying. And in that effort, we honor the people who made these marks, who pressed them into clay and left them for us to find. The script remains a mystery, but the mystery itself is part of the story. It is the part that keeps us coming back, keeps us wondering, keeps us looking at the seals with fresh eyes. The Indus people wrote. They wrote in a script we cannot read, and perhaps in the end that is enough. The act of writing connects us to them, even when the words remain unknown. Connections to today. The bull, so prominent on Indus seals, still holds a sacred place in many rural communities. The peacock, depicted in ancient pottery, remains a symbol of beauty across the subcontinent. These are not direct continuities, as no one can prove an unbroken chain. But the patterns are suggestive. Even without reading their words, we can trace the Indus legacy in living symbols that persist today. The script may remain a mystery, yet the visual language of the civilization speaks across the millennia through objects and beliefs that refuse to fade. The swastika deserves special mention. This ancient symbol appears on Indus seals and pottery. In South Asia, it remains a sacred mark of auspiciousness, used in ceremonies and drawn on thresholds. Its meaning in ancient times is uncertain, but its presence connects the distant past to living practice. The symbol was corrupted by its adoption in the West, but in its original homeland, it carries only positive connotations of well-being and good fortune. The revival of interest in this heritage is a modern phenomenon. For centuries, the Indus civilization was a forgotten world. The cities lay buried under mounds of earth. Local populations knew the ruins as old fortresses or haunted hills. They did not know they walked above one of the great cradles of human civilization. That changed in the 1920s. The excavations brought the ancient cities back into the light. But the deeper revival came later, with the independence movements of the mid-20th century. New nations needed origin stories. India and Pakistan both looked to the ancient past for sources of pride. The Indus civilization offered a glorious pre Islamic and pre Hindu heritage that both nations could claim. It predated the divisions that shaped the modern subcontinent. Today, that interest has grown into a powerful movement. School children across India and Pakistan learn about Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Museums display the famous seals with pride. Documentaries explore the mysteries of the script. Scholars from around the world devote their careers to understanding this ancient world. The internet has accelerated this revival. Anyone with a smartphone can now see the Great Bath, can study the intricate carvings on a seal, can marvel at the precision of ancient city planning. Social media platforms buzz with discussions about the latest excavations. Heritage enthusiasts travel thousands of miles to walk the ancient streets. The Rakhigarhi DNA study, published in recent years, captured global attention. It offered the first ancientome from the Indusian. The results confirmed what many had suspected. The people of the Indus Valley were ancestors of modern South Asians. They were not outsiders, not invaders, not a lost tribe. They were home. This genetic evidence carries deep emotional weight. It means that when a farmer in Punjab tills his field, he may be continuing a tradition that began 5,000 years ago. When a mother in Rajasthan adorns her daughter with bangles, she echoes a practice from the ancient cities. When a child in Mumbai plays a board game, they share a pastime with the children of Mohenjo-Daro. The connections are not just academic, they are personal. They are felt in the rhythms of daily life, in the foods prepared in kitchens, in the blessings spoken at weddings. The ancient Indus people did not leave behind great monuments or royal tombs. They left something more intimate. They left the patterns of everyday existence. Of course, we must be careful. The connections are real, but they are not simple. South Asia is a region of immense diversity. Many streams of ancestry and culture have merged over thousands of years. The Indus people are one thread in a vast tapestry. They are an important thread, a foundational thread, but not the only one. The people of the Indus Valley were part of a wider world. They traded with Mesopotamia, they shared ideas with Central Asia, they interacted with the Arabian Peninsula. Their genetic and cultural legacy is intertwined with these broader networks. No single modern population can claim to be their exclusive descendants, yet the connection remains deeply meaningful. For many South Asians, the Indus civilization represents a source of shared pride. It is a reminder that the subcontinent was home to one of the world's earliest urban societies. It is proof that sophisticated city life, with its planning and drainage and trade, flourished here thousands of years ago. The revival of interest has also sparked new questions. What did the Indus people believe? How did they govern themselves? Why did they choose to create such orderly cities? And what does their story tell us about our own urban futures? These questions resonate beyond South Asia. The Indus civilization offers lessons for the modern world. Its cities managed water with remarkable skill. They maintained sanitation systems that would not be matched for millennia. They created standardized weights and measures that facilitated trade across vast distances. They built communities that appear to have been remarkably balanced, without the grand palaces and tombs that dominate other ancient civilizations. The people of the Indus Valley may have something to teach us about sustainability, about social organization, about the balance between individual and community. Their story transcends the history of South Asia alone. It speaks to the broader human story, to what we are capable of building and sustaining. And so, the ancient cities are no longer forgotten ruins. They are living sites of connection. They are places where modern people come to touch the deep past. They are reminders that the human journey is long and that we are all part of it. The connections to today are not always visible. They hide in the shape of a pot, in the rhythm of a prayer, in the genetic code that links generations. But they are there. They are woven into the fabric of South Asian life. They are present in the silent streets of Mohenjo-Daro, where the ancient drains still carry the memory of rain. The people of the Indus Valley left no great chronicles. They left no names of kings or queens. They left no stories of conquest or glory. But they left something more enduring. They left the pattern of their lives, imprinted on the land and on the bodies of their descendants. And that is a legacy that cannot be lost. It lives on in every gesture of daily life that echoes the ancient past. It lives on in the curiosity of a child who asks about the people who built the old cities. It lives on in the pride of a community that recognizes its deep roots. The Indus civilization may have ended as a political entity, but as a human story, it never truly ended. It transformed, it merged, it flowed into the great river of South Asian history. And that river still flows today, carrying the memory of the ancient cities within its currents. The story does not end with the fall of the cities. It continues in the lives of billions of people who carry the ancient heritage in their blood and in their traditions. The connection between the past and the present curves and bends through centuries of change, yet the link remains unbroken. The people of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are not distant strangers. They are ancestors. They are us. And in recognizing them, we recognize something essential about ourselves. The Lost Empire remembered here was a society that valued art, that had the resources to support artists, that saw beauty as worth creating and preserving. Then there is the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro. Waterproof bricks, bitumen sealant, a carefully engineered drain. The people who built this did not just want to bathe. They wanted to bathe in a place that would last. They built for permanence in a way that forces us to ask what we are building today that will survive us. The seals tell us about trade. The weights tell us about commerce. The granaries tell us about surplus. But the bath tells us about something else. It tells us about the soul of this people. They cared about cleanliness. They cared about ritual. They cared about creating public spaces where people could gather and find meaning. We must also acknowledge what we do not know. The script remains undeciphered. The names of their kings, if they had kings, are lost. Their religion, their laws, their poetry, their songs, all of it is beyond our reach. We have the skeleton of their civilization, but not its breath. Every translation of a lost language begins with a bilingual text. For the Indus script, no such key has been found. It may be a language. It may be a system of symbols that held meaning without representing speech. The absence of an answer is not a failure. It is a reminder that some doors do not open easily. Yet even in our ignorance, we can see the outline of their genius. They understood flood management in an era when most of the world was still learning to write. They built cities with street grids that put some modern towns to shame. They developed a system of weights so consistent that it served traders from the Arabian Sea to the mountains of Afghanistan. They did all of this without leaving behind any evidence of a standing army, a royal tomb, or a monument to a single ruler. That last point deserves a pause. Every great civilization we know from the ancient world left us something grand. Egypt gave us pyramids. Mesopotamia gave us ziggurats and laws carved in stone. China gave us walls and palaces. The Indus people gave us cities. Efficient, well-planned, comfortable cities. They gave us the extraordinary gift of the ordinary. Their greatness was not in monuments to power, but in the quality of daily life. The houses in Mohenjo-Daro were not hovels crowded around a royal palace. They were substantial structures with private wells and indoor bathrooms. The streets were not chaotic alleys, but planned avenues with drainage systems that modern engineers still admire. This was not a civilization of a few rich and many poor. It was a society that seems to have spread its wealth with unusual fairness. The decline came slowly, as these things often do. Climate shifted. The monsoon patterns that had watered their fields became less reliable. The rivers that gave them life may have changed course, leaving their cities stranded. They did not fall to a dramatic invasion or a burning conquest. They faded, adapted, and eventually moved on. The people did not disappear. They dispersed, carrying their genes and their crafts into the wider subcontinent. Their blood flows in the veins of billions of people today. But their cities were swallowed by the earth. Their writing was forgotten. Their name was erased from history until the 1850s, when railway engineers unknowingly used ancient bricks as ballast for the Lahore-Multan line. It took until the 1920s when archaeologists like John Marshall recognized what these bricks truly were, the remnants of an empire lost to time. What lay scattered across the landscape meant nothing until someone knew where to look. There is a lesson here that goes beyond archaeology. Every civilization believes it is permanent. Every civilization is wrong. The grass grows over the stones, the dust covers the inscriptions, the names of the great are forgotten, and the works of the humble endure only if someone digs them up. Today, the sites face new threats, not from conquest or climate, but from neglect, encroachment, and the slow wearing of time. The bricks are being looted for reuse. The groundwater is rising and damaging the foundations. The very moisture that once supported life now threatens to dissolve what remains. Preservation is not just a scientific duty, it is a moral one. These ruins are not just the remains of a lost people. They are a mirror held up to our own civilization. When we look at Mohenjo-Daro, we see what we could be. We see a society that managed its resources wisely. We see a culture that built for comfort and community rather than for glory and fear. We see people who cared about their water, their waste, their neighbors. The Indus Valley Civilization did not leave us a list of great kings to memorize. It did not leave us epic poems of conquest and loss. It left us something more valuable. It left us proof that a complex, urban, prosperous society can be built without a cult of personality at its center. That a people can be great without being warlike. That progress can be measured not in monuments, but in the quality of everyday life. The dancing girl stands forever in her museum case. The unicorn seals turn up in new excavations. The script waits in silence, holding its secrets. The cities sleep beneath their mounds, and every year brings new discoveries that reshape our understanding. We are still learning from them, still asking questions, still finding new reasons to be amazed. And that is perhaps their greatest gift, not just what they built, but what they continue to teach us. They remind us that human achievement does not always look like a pyramid. Sometimes it looks like a well-planned city with good drainage. Sometimes it looks 4-inch bronze statue of a girl who danced. Sometimes it looks like a standard brick, fired and uniform, holding a wall together for 5,000 years. They remind us that we are not the first people to face climate change or urban challenges or the question of how to live together in crowded places. They faced these things and built something remarkable. We can do the same. The Indus civilization is gone. Its cities are ruins. Its language is silent. But its story is not over. It lives on in every bead, every seal, every carefully laid brick that archaeologists pull from the earth. It lives on in the questions we ask and the answers we have yet to find. And it lives on in us, in the blood of the billions who carry their genes, in the traditions of the crafts they perfected, in the very idea that a civilization can be remembered not for its wars, but for its peace, not for its rulers, but for its people, not for its monuments, but for its homes. The lost empire is no longer lost. It is found, and it is ours to protect, to study, and to learn from. For as long as we remember it, it is not truly gone. As long as we tell its story, it lives.